We'll be starting in about 1 minute. Good morning. As the MRAC designated federal officer, it is my pleasure to call this meeting to order. Before we begin this morning's panels, I would like to turn to Commissioner Sharon Bowen, the MRAC sponsor, for the welcome. Acting Chairman Giancarlo and Commissioner Bowen will then give their opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to try to keep us on schedule. It's a pretty long agenda this morning, so I'm going to turn it over to Acting Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Bowen. Thank you all for being here today, coming to Drisley, Washington for 3 hours of your very important, very valuable time. Today's meeting has three of the most important ingredients, I think, for a great meeting. It has a really terrific and well-prepared agenda, compliments to Commissioner Bowen and her team. It has great, a great program, important topics to discuss, and then most importantly, it has really great participants, all of you that have put in the time to be prepared for this presentation today. So thank you all for coming, and I'll hand it back to Commissioner Bowen.
Great. It's a great pleasure to welcome you guys here to our first meeting of the Market Risk Advisory Committee of 2017. I would first like to thank Acting Chairman Giancarlo for being here today and for his longstanding support for the work of this committee. Acting Chairman Giancarlo and I were confirmed together, and we've always worked well together. So I look forward to continuing in our shared endeavor to provide for a safer, stronger financial system for the American people. Thank you as well to the staffs of the Office of the Chief Economist, the Division of Clearing and Risk Management, and the Division of Market Oversight for providing technical support for this meeting. And last but not least, thank you to the logistical staff who worked behind the scenes to put everything together today. Before turning to today's meeting, I have the happy task of welcoming three new members. I never tire of praising this committee, which has worked with passion and diligence to provide excellent advice and insight. I'm confident that these three new members, who are well known and respected in the industry, will only augment the effectiveness of our committee. They are Biz Chatterjee, where are you, Biz? Global Head of Electronic Trading and New Business Development and Credit Markets at Citigroup. Dale Michaels, Executive Vice President of Financial Risk Management at the Options Clearing Corporation. And Marnie Rosenberg, Global Head of Clearinghouse Risk and Strategy at JP Morgan. Welcome, Biz, Dale, and Marnie. Now, turning to today's topics, I'm greatly looking forward to our first panel in which DCR staff will discuss their reaction to the MRAC's CCCP risk management recommendations that were voted on last November. I personally believe that these are incredibly helpful recommendations, and I want to thank the members of the committee who worked so hard in developing and preparing these recommendations. I've heard that market participants have similarly found these recommendations to be helpful. And given the importance that CCPs play in our markets, it is imperative that we stay ever vigilant on CCP risk management. Thus, I look forward to the staff's presentation. I think our other two topics, cybersecurity and the evolving market structure, are also of great importance. In fact, cybersecurity is probably the most important market risk issue of our decade. I look forward to hearing from our experienced panel on the current trends in this ever-changing threat to our markets. and I'm eager to get market intelligence from our NRAC members on our last panel. It's become an NRAC tradition to start the year by first looking at the state of the market. Our diverse markets are changing in such a rapid pace that it is invaluable to hear about that evolution, and in fact, sometimes revolution, from a broad cross-section of market participants. It really informs our oversight as an agency. To that end, this panel will focus on how well our derivatives markets are functioning, including discussions on volatility, liquidity, the impact of the leverage ratio, the repo market, and the impact of rising interest rates. I think this will prove to be one of the most substantive and informative meetings yet, which is a very high bar to set. So thank you all, and with that, I'll now turn over the proceedings to our designated federal officer, Petal Walker.
Thank you for your opening remarks. As noted in today's agenda, our first panel discussion will be on the staff response to the CCP Risk Management Subcommittee's recommendations for CCP default management. I would like to introduce Ms. Susan O'Flynn, Managing Director and Global Head of CCP Strategy, Governance, and Optimization at Morgan Stanley, who will facilitate and help shape the discussions during this first panel.
Good morning. Firstly, thanks to Commissioner Bowen for sponsoring the MRAC and getting this esteemed group together, and also a welcome to our new members. Also thanks to Commissioner Giancarlo for being here today and presiding over the proceedings. And last but definitely not least, thanks to Petal Walker for working tirelessly to get us to where we are today. We, the industry participants, look forward to hearing the CFTC's responses to our recommendations on CCP default management and the roles and the responsibilities of market participants, both from a client and clearing member perspective, may play in the future. The timing of today's meeting is very interesting. Yesterday, we saw the commencement of the largest coordinated drill globally, both from a product scope, rates, FX, repo, and listed derivatives, among others, and number of CCPs involved, LCH, Eurex, and CME, that I have seen in the last several years at a time of increased market volumes and potential volatility following Sunday's votes in France. This clearly addresses and acknowledges some of the final recommendations and will test both CCPs and market participants' capacity in a more realistic environment. Maybe one for the next MRAC for a review. With that, I'm going to hand over to Kate, Bob, and John for their responses. Just from a logistical perspective, the present Kate, Bob, and John will speak for roughly 10 minutes. There will be a Q&A session afterwards. If you would like to speak, raise your card and press the button to speak. With that, I turn over to Kate Meyer, who's going to make the introductions. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, all. I'm here with my colleagues, Bob Wasserman and John Lawton, and we have reviewed the recommendations from the CCP Risk Management Subcommittee, and we'd like to provide a few comments. We have a very short deck here, a PowerPoint that kind of highlights each of the recommendations, and we'll discuss them in turn. So, as most of you are aware, the CCP Risk Management Subcommittee developed recommendations related to CCP default management. DCR staff has reviewed the recommendations. We find the recommendations to be thoughtful and useful and consistent in large part with CFTC regulations. DCR staff supports the recommendations, and we are ready to work with the community to the extent that further progress needs to be made in some of the recommendations. I think we can say some of them have already been achieved, and so we'll go over them. At a high level, there were two broad categories of recommendations. The first related to coordination, harmonization, and enhancement. There were 5 topics under that broad category, which we will go through in the slide presentation. And then the second broad category is porting. Key issues have been identified, and as I think everyone is aware, that is probably the stickiest wicket, the most difficult task still remaining, is how best to manage porting, particularly since, credit to all the CCPs is that there have been very few defaults in the history of our industry, so there has not been a lot of practice with this. The last one that we all know of was, at least the most significant one, October 31st of 2011, was MF Global. And so the CCPs have done a fine job, as well as the clearing members themselves, to ensure that we do not end up with systemic risk problems. And with that, I'll turn over to the first. First I'm going to describe how it is that these recommendations are consistent with the CFTC regulations. The CEA, Part 39 of the Commodity Exchange Act has two regulations related to default. There's 3916 in Subpart B and then 3935 in Subpart C. The 3916 regulations, default regulations, have been part of DCR's examination program for the past 5 years. So as some of the CCPs can attest, to those that are here, we have gone in and we have evaluated CCP's compliance with this regulation. Now keep in mind that the core principles do allow for reasonable discretion. The CCPs have reasonable discretion in how they implement and comply with these regulations. So with that being considered, each CCP may have procedures that are somewhat different from another CCP. They're not required to have identical procedures. But the rules and the procedures right now require all of these, that the CCP's written default management plan incorporate all of these concepts. The first is that they conduct an annual test, a fire drill, a simulation. We require also that they vary the scenarios that they use in their default management drills each year, so that they're not just testing one aspect of it. For example, the auction process. We have found that the CCPs have the auction process down pretty well, particularly with respect to swaps, but there are a lot more things to consider in a default, including the magnitude of the default and liquidity issues and things like that. So our CCPs now do vary their default management script each year. The scenarios do include testing all the procedures that affect clearing members and customers. That's not a requirement every year, but we do ask that the CCPs default. If last year they didn't include a shortfall or a default in the customer origin, then next year they should consider that. The rules must be disclosed. The CCP must disclose to the public its rules in terms of how it will manage a default, including its default waterfall and any obligations imposed on the clearing members. The first recommendation is related to communication. As we saw during the MF Global situation, there was a lot of good communication that took place, but also some people, I think, felt communication could have been better, particularly at the customer side. At times it wasn't exactly clear which positions had been transferred or were going to be transferred or where they were going to be transferred to. And Bob will be addressing that concept a little bit later. But the subcommittee did a great job, and the very first, I think, significant accomplishment is they created this, am I skipping ahead of myself? They created a list of global that's it. The directory of contacts has been created. I'm not sure how widely circulated it has been because I don't have a copy of it, but apparently, if it's confidential information and it's the key decision makers at each of the CCPs, so each CCP knows who to, has the phone number and the name of who to contact in the event that there is a default of a significant clearing member that has clearing relationships at multiple CCPs. Anyway, the minutes of the recommendations say that this directory has been created, so presumably the CCPs do have it, which was a great idea, and the fact that they've already achieved it is also an excellent accomplishment. So that directory does contain this detailed information that CCPs would need to enhance communication as they're managing a default. The other recommendation is a great idea, and this has to do with establishing a mechanism so that CCPs can communicate to clearing members and customers of clearing members the exact status of their positions for non-defaulting customers, whether they're being transferred, whether they have to be liquidated. I am not certain what the status is of that initiative, so maybe someone on the subcommittee that's worked on it could provide the group a status, but we wholeheartedly support that initiative and think it's a great idea. Okay, the next recommendation is related to the default management committees. All CCPs have default management committees. They have a variety of responsibilities, again, given that CCPs have reasonable discretion in how they plan to manage a default. The first responsibility is, and what many consider to be the most important, is the seconded traders aspect, that CCP regulations in many cases require that clearing members have traders available to participate, to go off in a secure room and assist the CCP in managing a defaulted portfolio or a defaulted situation, which, depending on whether it's customer or house, whether it's futures or swaps, you know, the requirements and the things that these seconded traders have to do may vary, but the concern that's been highlighted over time is that if there was to be a default of a major clearing member who clears at 8 different CCPs and they happen to have the same trader names on each CCP's seconded trader list, well, then there's going to be a shortfall in terms of traders available. So the recommendation is that first of all, the CCPs need to communicate amongst each other to try and avoid having overlap. Most CCPs will change out the names of the seconded traders quarterly or semi-annually. And so the recommendation, which we support and think is a good idea, that the CCPs communicate with each other about which names are on their lists to be seconded at which period of time. Furthermore, there is an obligation on the part of the clearing members to notify the CCP if any of those traders leave the firm or may otherwise not be available. So we thought that that was a great recommendation as well. Okay, and next I'm going to turn it over to John Lawton, who's going to talk about fire drill was the next recommendation.
Thanks, Kate. Good morning. As Susan mentioned, this is very timely because, in fact, a fire drill was commenced yesterday, and so I'm going to give you a little bit of, in the middle of it, a little bit of an update. So the MRAC did recommend that the CCPs conduct coordinated exercises. The one that's going on right now includes 3 very big clearing organizations, CME, Eurex, and LCH. They're hitting a number of markets, including IRS and equity index and repos. The regulators that have been participating include the CFTC, the Bank of England, BaFin, and Bundesbank. I can't give a lessons learned yet because the auction portion actually hasn't been completed, but I can provide some flavor of how things have progressed so far in the exercise. Our staff was on site at the CME offices in New York yesterday. Similarly, Bank of England staff was on site at LCH, my understanding is, and Bundesbank and BaFin staff were on site at Eurex in Germany. At the CME, the default that was declared yesterday was in a large interest rate swap portfolio. CME had 8 traders from 7 firms seconded at the CME office. The exercise started about 8 a.m. yesterday. The traders were divided up by currency, so there were 2 for dollars, 2 for pounds, 2 for euros, and 2 for pesos. Our staff observed and asked questions as the traders designed a series of trades that would hedge the defaulted portfolio. Essentially, they divided it into 2 steps, macro hedge and then later micro hedge, and so they would send out the requests for bids to clearing member firms. The clearing member firms responded. The traders, in consultation with the CME, chose which bids to accept. They basically got the positions hedged by approximately shortly after noon yesterday. Then in the afternoon, there was valuation done of what is the value of, well, what is the new position once you incorporate into it the hedged positions that were executed as part of the exercise. And there was valuation, there was marking to market, what's the current value of this hedged position now. Later in the day, the CME then sent out the position to firms for bidding. The firms will have 2 days to analyze the position. The actual auction will take place on Thursday. Our staff has received written reports of, again, they're marking the position to market in the meantime as they would in a real default situation, and then checking what is the margin erosion of the position against the margin that they're holding. Again, I can't go into the details of how the LCH and Eurex auctions are proceeding, but essentially they're very similar. The procedures aren't precisely the same, but they're very similar. Our staff has a conference call for later this morning, in fact, with the Bank of England and the German regulators to compare notes on what we've observed so far and what we're expecting for the later part of the exercise on Thursday. We will do that again after the auction once we see what happened with the auctions on Thursday and possibly going into Friday at the other clearinghouses. We'll again speak with the representatives of the other regulators. We also plan to have discussions with each of the CCPs and with the clearing firms that participated in the exercise. We're going to try to get everybody's views on what worked well, what didn't work so well, what suggestions for improvement there might be, for example, along the lines of setting up portfolios in similar formats or additional coordination among the CCPs or among the regulators in the course of such an event. After we've gone through sort of our due diligence with the various participants, we will prepare a briefing for the Commission. I'm expecting we'll probably have some recommendations. I can't say what they are at this moment, but our staff is already thinking about stuff that they've observed. And again, we want to consult with our other regulatory colleagues and with the participants to get everybody's ideas before we put together a briefing and B, probably some recommendations. Thank you.
So John, just a quick question on the fire drill. Was it just limited to the clearing members, or did we try to include non-clearing members?
I think that it's sort of broken up into a couple of pieces, and with regard to the auction of the CME equity index positions, I think there's some non-clearing members that they would like to participate in the auction. That was put off for a day because there was some concern about, as everyone knows, about the French election, and so it ended up not, that part of the exercise didn't take place yesterday. But yes, so there will be some participation because that's, again, something people are interested in. How well will it work? There's complications if you have end users, but again, there is an interest in ensuring as much liquidity as possible in an auction process. I think, is it back to Bob or back to Kate?
Okay, with that, the next recommendation is related to the auction process. The two key themes here are communication and harmonization, consistency. We applaud these recommendations. In large part, they're on the CCPs to engage in the communication, and to the extent that they can and choose to harmonize their procedures and their plans and then publicly communicate them, that would be a laudable goal. Also, applause should go out to the Default Risk Management Working Group who developed this document. The uniform CCP terminology for default management auctions. I don't know if the author wants to stand up and take a bow, but it's very well written. It's a primer on how auctions work, And there's a lot of good information in this. So this is in the public domain. This is on the CFTC website. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bob Wasserman.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk very briefly about customer participation in auctions. At bottom, as Kate and John were saying, we very much want auctions to succeed. It's much better to have a voluntary market-based tool because the alternatives are very unpalatable, things like mandatory tools such as partial tear-up. And so to enhance the likelihood that the auction succeeds, it's frankly, other things equal, better to have additional participants in the auction, and having qualified non-clearing members participate then increases the likelihood of success by expanding the scope of bids. And so I think the recommendation, which I think is a very good one, is that CCP should be encouraged to consider permitting non-clearing members to bid. Obviously, you need to have appropriate policies and procedures around that. You need to make sure that all of this participation is supported by a clearing member in good standing, because they have to ultimately guarantee those bids if the bids are winning ones. And as well, there are some interesting issues around front running and confidentiality that need to be taken into account. Turning to porting, which was discussed before. This is something that personally is very near and dear to my heart, because when we have a failure of a FCM, it is critical to take the clients, and particularly if it's a client-led default, the non-defaulting clients, and port them to safe harbor. And that has always been a goal of the Commission and staff. And indeed, 764B of the Bankruptcy Code protects this. It is directly encouraged in the Commission's Part 190 regulations as well. Doing that, a successful port protects both the customers, who do not have to reestablish their positions, but as well the markets, because if you cannot successfully port, the alternative is all of these customers are going to get liquidated. And that is just simply not good for the markets, and it's most assuredly not good for the clients. Historically, we have in fact taken a very practical approach towards fostering transfers, both before bankruptcy, when clearing members get into trouble, and looking at certain possibilities under our Part 1 regulations. But as well, staff have basically spent quite a few all-nighters trying, and along, of course, with folks at the clearinghouses and the SROs, trying to find ways to successfully port customers as quickly as possible, again, to avoid having to liquidate all of those customer positions. I can also say, I know there was some concerns around bankruptcy court approval. My experience has been that bankruptcy court approval has been quite prompt, quite reliable. You have bankruptcy court judges scheduling hearings on hours' notice. You have hearings being held outside of normal court hours. I think, bankruptcy court judges I've appeared before have been very, very practical in their approaches. And so we've been very successful to this point. Indeed, I recall, but the trend line is not necessarily good. I recall in the case of REFCO, the privilege of being the transferee was auctioned off. And indeed, the bids went from $80 to $200 million. So basically, $200 million was paid for the privilege of taking those customer positions. In the case of Lehman, you had one entity, and really, I don't think they paid anything for it. And in the case of MF Global, I think there were ultimately 10 transferees that were, and homes were found for all the customers. But now, of course, remember, in order to have transfer, in order to have porting, you need to have willing and able transferees. And as we see, the trend line's been going in, I think, the wrong direction. Now you have FCMs who are not looking for customer business, but who are, because of the leverage ratio, pushing it away during normal times. And so I will say that I am personally quite concerned that during a crisis time, during a time of market stress, the ability to find homes for these customers, to find firms that are willing and able to take these customer positions on is much less sure, frankly, much less likely than I personally would like, and it concerns me a great deal. And I know you're going to be talking more about the leverage ratio later. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to open it to the broader group for any questions, observations, or comments. Marnie.
Thanks, Susan. So the first thing I would say is congratulations to the subcommittee on putting these together, led by Susan. I think these are really excellent, and JP Morgan has been really supportive of all of these recommendations, and obviously, as both a dealer and a clearing member, very involved in all of the fire drills and the work that's been done in the market. More a question for the clearinghouses in terms of implementation on some of these recommendations. So one question I have is on the harmonization of auction procedures and for specific asset classes, meaning those that obviously clear interest rate swaps. Is there work being done to harmonize some of those procedures? I think that would really work to reduce potential operational risk in a crisis and cause less confusion in the markets. And then the second point I can't emphasize enough is the coordination and sort of standards on frequency and rotation on trader secondment. We continue to see in the market with more and more electronic trading, less traders. And so I think there's a careful balance between members being able to have sufficient resources on the desks to manage our own internal risks, obviously, as our own regulators need us, and as from an internal risk management we need to do. So I think the more we can kind of streamline the dependency across the market on the secondment would be a really good outcome. And I think having a sort of more structured process in terms of rotations would be very helpful. And the final point I would make to what Bob was just saying is, we are very supportive of broader participation in auctions, and I think it really is about how to implement that, because there are different ways of doing that. And so I'm very happy to see that there's a lot of support across the clearing member community on that. Thank you.
Sunil, do you want to respond?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much, Susan. A few things, though. First is I echo Marnie's comments. We CCPs appreciate that. We really want to establish a system where we coordinate, the resources that we tap into during a default, because this is a time of stress, and our goal is not to deplete our members of resources that they need to manage their own risks. So we're working towards that. I think this coordinated drill is actually a test of that, and we'll see how it worked out. But as a group, we've been working on that. On the second item, in terms of auction harmonization for like products, I think that's what you're pointing to. I think the CCPs work together to put that framework together so that we could get to a good place, to a good starting point. Of course, we have different mechanisms for communicating right now. We do share with OCC an infrastructure for auction participants. Dale, when he was at CME, started that process, so we've taken that to the next level. So we continue to use that. We'd like to invite other CCPs to also participate in that same infrastructure, so it makes it simpler. So I think the objective is to reduce as much operational risk as possible. So we agree with that. I think the last thing I was going to point out is there was some question from Kate and others on progress on communication. Now here, in relates to porting, in relation to porting. So here, what we've done is, especially for the futures world, a CCP doesn't have end customer information as a matter of normal course of business. So what we have done is we've passed a rule requiring information about end customers from firms to be used exactly in the instance that we pointed out. This is one of the biggest lessons that we learned from 2011 and MF Global is having access to end customers so we can communicate with them when their clearing firm has an issue during the porting process. So that process is underway. There are firms already submitting information. We still have some work to do. We have to complete that. For the over-the-counter markets, customers register with us directly, so we do have contact information. But for futures markets, we are going through that process. That is step one. Step two is coming up with a harmonized process to actually communicate. Here too, in porting, it makes sense to coordinate. We CCPs agree that it makes sense to coordinate amongst ourselves because customers typically use a single firm across CCPs and they net settle. So we would, when you port these customers to another clearing firm, you don't want to break that netting set for them. So that will result in a liquidity demand on them. So we are very cognizant of that. That's an important part of our coordination exercise. So, but for this exercise, we avoided porting. We avoided customer porting as one of the scenarios in order to further develop this process. So I thought it'll be useful for everybody to hear where we are so far.
Richard?
Thank you, Susan. I think that we're on a good course here, and I had a couple of follow-up questions, maybe for you, John, concerning the coordinated fire drill that you're engaging in. As end users, we're everyone here is concerned. End users are of course concerned and don't have as much transparency as other market participants have. The clearing members and the CCPs. So just a couple of follow-up questions. Are you, in the current fire drill that you're doing, what's the severity that you're assuming of the default? Are you assuming two largest clearing members? I'm curious. And I guess looking forward, what kind of transparency can we expect in the way of feedback to the market participants and the market in general as to the results of the fire drill and what we can expect and when?
On the first one, it's just a single firm at each CCP in this exercise. Feedback, I guess we haven't really focused on that, but I think we're very open. I think that's a very good suggestion that, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk to the people who participated in it. I think it probably would make sense to, after we've sort of pulled together those thoughts, talk to people who didn't participate and talk to them about what do you think? Are there sort of explain how it went and some of the lessons learned that we thought, and perhaps get some feedback from other market participants who were not participants. I think that's a very good suggestion.
Dale?
Thanks, Susan. Just to echo a little bit of what Sunil mentioned about the standardization of the member auction process. This has been something that's been going on for quite a while. It was several years ago where OCC first started using a third-party platform, showed it to the colleagues at CME. They started using the same platform so that we're using one infrastructure. Members can put bid in that same platform so they don't have to learn the different procedures for the different CCPs. When we do joint drills with CME, which we've done for several years now on the exchange-traded products, that is used with the platform and able to have folks bid fairly aggressively since they already know what that platform looks like. They don't have to ask questions. It basically fills some of the operational holes that could come up. As far as the broader participation, having gone through a number of real-life events, one thing we have found out is that we very much endeavor to have more than just clearing members participate. We want to see the end users participate in a drill. They tend to be very aggressive when they are participating in the auction process. For some clearing members, when we have gone to them for certain portfolios, a lot of times it takes, they have to get approval to take in certain products. And getting that approval in a very short period of time for some very large broker-dealers is just not possible. When you're having end users, prop shops, and other types of end users, they could react very quickly. They could look at the portfolio and come up with bids and come up with their assessment of where their portfolio might be going very quickly and come up with some very aggressive bids. So one thing we found out is that we very much want to bring other folks into the business of doing the auction process. In fact, at OCC, we now put in our rules that all members are required to test with us, so that we know that we have a full bench of possible participants in an auction process. Last thing I want to address is Bob's comments and concerns on portability. We very much share those as well. With the leverage ratio, what has happened is that even in peacetime, what we were seeing with members is that they're asking business to leave. This is no longer a theoretical issue. I just received some information from a member this week that said they had let two clients, I should say, go to another firm. They asked them to leave because of the leverage ratio, not because of the credit concerns, not because of the risk of the portfolio, just because of the size of the option portfolio as compared to the risk. It was impacting the leverage ratio. So this is, again, no longer theoretical. And this is in peacetime. We go into a stressful situation. One thing that does concern us, and I think the CFTC, Bob mentioned, has been very practical in their approach during those stress times, and I could not agree more. But we would like to see other regulators also take that type of approach so that we have some type of temporary restraint on things such as leverage ratio or other capital issues, so that we could assure that we have portability with clients in these stress times. If we're seeing clients being pushed away now in a peacetime because of the leverage ratio, I think you're going to see even more of that come when it's a stress time. We won't be able to have clients move over very successfully. The last one with MF Global, it was not easy to move them over to more than 10 clearing members. It was a struggle to find the 10 clearing members, but eventually it worked out during that week. But that was without the regulatory issues that we have now with the leverage ratio and other concerns. Thanks.
Dennis.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. I just want to respond to Richard's question about the fire drill that's going on at the moment. Some more color, if you like, and to John's comments about it. So the proof of the pudding is in the eating, in my view. And here we wanted to be a little bit more extreme. So yes, we're assuming that one member goes into default, but in our CCP, that member was not put in default until afternoon. So that late in the day problem for investing cash really comes up. It was a member with significant PPS relationships. So then we were testing the pipes, if you like, for how money gets to the CCP through intermediary means. It also provided settlement function. And it was also a large counterparty for our treasury function. So we were hitting a lot of points here. It wasn't just the normal test the auction, so to speak. It also, the market stress was Brexit-like, so it was fairly significant stress. And this member also had a lot of client positions, so they were in the process now of porting them. It was of the order of 400 clients' positions that we needed to figure out how to port to.
Okay, before we wrap this up, I just think I want to make a comment. You know, so far in the drill, yesterday was a very busy day, and I think what I really appreciate as a clearing member is the cross-product nature of this. I think we have been somewhat too focused on looking at OTC IRS without looking at the broader overall impact and communication to clearing members when you're talking about multi-products. Some clearinghouses clear 3 to 7 different types of product ranges, and the communication that comes from those clearinghouses can be quite different depending on the product silo. So I think it's going to be a great acid test for both clearing members' participation on a cross-product basis, but also the CCP communication and coordination around all of those products. But we're only into day 2, and we have another 8 days to go. So with that, I'm just going to wrap it up and turn it to Petal.
Thank you, Susan. We'll have a 5-minute break before we start panel 2. Thank you. We'll start in about 1 minute. you can please come back to your seats. We're slightly behind schedule, and we'll try to get back on schedule. It is a pleasure to call this meeting back to order. As noted in today's agenda, our second panel discussion will be on cybersecurity. I would like to introduce Mr. Dennis McLaughlin, Group Chief Risk Officer at LCH, who will facilitate and help shape the discussions during this second panel.
Thank you, Petal, and thanks to the commissioners for facilitating what promises to be a very, very interesting discussion on cyber risk. We're privileged to have three well-known industry experts in this area. Steve Chabinsky, who's a partner at White & Case. Carl Schimmick, who's the Global Head of Vulnerability Management at Morgan Stanley. And Gil Vega, who's the Chief Information Security Officer at CME Group. So as we begin this, as a CRO, it was quite useful to me when I first read the paper, the framework written by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, on how to think about cyber risk, because it's an issue which is very concerning to risk officers all over the world. And the framework basically has four components. The first thing you have to do is identify the key assets in your organization. So be it data, be it money, be it securities, wherever it is, but you have to know where they are. You then have to, of course, put in strategies to protect such key assets. You must have a strategy to detect any threats to those key assets. And you must be able to respond and recover to any threats that you perceive. So there are lots of interesting questions around this. Having assumed that we've identified the key assets, the Commission has laid down three very important questions which fall into the other three categories. So around protection, protecting the assets, and responding and recovering. So I'll just ask the first key question, what are the current cybersecurity considerations in the application of emerging technologies in the swaps and futures market? So for example, cloud computing, fintech, distributed ledger technology, automated and algorithmic trading. So I'll start with Gil, if you wouldn't mind responding to that.
Sure. I'll respond briefly and allow my fellow panelists to jump in as well. Thank you for having me here today. I would categorize these into truly emerging technologies such as the Internet of Things, such as distributed ledgers, such as digital currencies, and technologies that have been around a while that are actually starting to make an impact in the financial sector, including things like cloud security, cloud applications and the security implications around that. I would say that some of the things, some of the considerations that we take into account in partnership with our peer firms and our competitors, because we talk to them all the time, are making sure that not only do we have the staff available that have the requisite knowledge of these new technologies, but we also make sure that we do a lot of research into potential vulnerabilities around these emerging technologies, but also try to understand how the vulnerabilities will be leveraged from a threat actor perspective. So I know CME Group is not unique in our ability to really understand our threat landscape and understand some of the actors that focus on our industry, but also our company. And having the ability to do that can help us anticipate some of the threat actors and their motivations as they target some of these new technologies.
Just to add, I think a couple points to that one was for third party, I think is a really large consideration, and very much is starting to go hand in hand when we talk about cybersecurity. We talk about third party risk management. When you look at cloud vendors, you look at distributed ledger, you're talking about pushing a lot of your key technology components outside of your four walls, and then how do you gain transparency and have oversight to that? And do it in a controlled way that will allow you to make sure you're managing the risks, but you've outsourced those things for a reason. So making sure that those firms in many cases that are concentrated, as we look at our cloud service providers, how are they managing the risks and what is the oversight that's being put on those? Because in many cases, those are not financial services firms. They are pure technology providers. I think one other piece, consideration as we look at some of the emerging tech is just, kind of what we want to promote innovation. I think that's a really core component to financial services and, helps us, from a business sense. But how do we do that in a controlled way? How do we do that with, making sure security is baked in from the beginning, doesn't become a bolt-on afterwards, but that is that key consideration because the evolution in the last 20, 30 years, we've gotten to a point now where technology is, not something that's, it's not an enabler to our business. It's actually a key component. There is no ability to go manual anymore. There's no ability to do anything without technology. So, how do we make sure that anything that we're bringing in is being brought in a safe way? It's being thoughtful. The incentives are in the right places. Security is baked in. And then, how do we make sure we do those for those firms that, may not have regulatory oversight?
I wanted to first start by thanking the Commission for having us here and the members as well. This is an extremely important topic to all of us. And I think I would start by briefly discussing the NIST framework that you mentioned, because I think it has added a lot of clarity and harmony to cybersecurity, at least the way we talk about it, and also to commend the Commission. And in fact, other federal regulators for seeking the harmonization of cybersecurity rules that we spoke about earlier today, which is extremely important. That said, I think it's extremely important for us to realize that cybersecurity frameworks are perhaps more easily said than accomplished. And the NIST framework, before you get to the appendix, it's only 17 pages long. If someone here has not read it, I recommend it. At least for me, I confess to being a geek or a nerd or whatever. I found it to be a good read. But it's in very many ways, because it's so easy to read, it belies the difficulty underneath the hood. And when you get to the appendix in the back, you recognize that these 5 simple functions break down into a group of almost 24 categories, which further breaks down into almost 100 subcategories, each of which would give any professional a battle behind it. And that's not even to mention all of the third parties that we're discussing now that we've grown reliant upon both directly and indirectly. Directly, when I say directly, there are the products and services that we ourselves run in our businesses and those that we contract for. And I consider both of those direct. We have some sort of control, whether it's through audit or understanding certifications or more directly actually providing the security features that we need in order to contract. But indirectly, we are relying upon an ecosystem now that impacts all of our businesses in ways, I think, best demonstrated by the recent Dyn DDoS attack, where we see simple IoT devices already mentioned, at least in the hundreds of thousands that were taken over in people's houses, turn into a massive attack that included what I would say is the underlying infrastructure for the internet that all businesses rely upon and then become victim of. To put that in perspective as we talk today, we all remember the DDoS attacks that harmed the financial services industry over 4 years ago, widely attributed to Iran. The attack at that time was claimed to be in the nature of 65 billion bits per second flooding computers. That sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, and it was massively larger at the time than other attacks before it. The IoT attack that we just witnessed that affected this DNS service is reported to have been at 1.2 trillion bits per second. So that's by way of saying that the internet that we've grown reliant upon and that we regulate and that we try internally to control has become increasingly out of any individual organization's control, and it fundamentally relies upon frameworks that may appear simpler than they actually are to achieve. That said, the increasing technologies that we're discussing today are steps in the right direction. Mr. Vega mentioned cloud security as one example. When we talk about cloud systems, oftentimes we forget to talk about how the cloud has actually been used to advance security in ways that otherwise we really would not be able to achieve security objectives. This includes, for example, DDoS mitigation, which without cloud resources would not be possible. It includes endpoint detection monitoring, where each endpoint is providing information in a cloud environment that's sharing information automatically with one another, and in fact able now to update and upgrade systems and reporting in a way that almost starts to look like a self-healing network. So I think a closing comment for this question, for just this part, when we talk about the cloud, is to recognize that cloud resources are being used both as an innovator and as a security measure.
Thanks, Steve. You're actually talking a little bit, beginning to speak to question 2 as well, which is the emerging threat environment. So if I could move on, it's a good segue. What do you think the current cybersecurity threat environment and risk exposure to the financial sector, ransomware, and other cybercrime, recent attacks on financial institutions and networks? So what do you think what are your thoughts on that current evolution, if you like? So maybe Gil?
Sure, we've seen this evolve very rapidly over the last decade or so, and it continues to evolve to the point that major financial services companies like CME and the large banks have teams dedicated to really getting an understanding of what that current threat is, which could change very dynamically. It could change in days based on a new vulnerability, based on a change in the geopolitical situation globally, and it could change based on the capabilities of these actors that seek to do us some harm. Going back to the CSF, the Cybersecurity Framework, I just want to say that, we'll get to this a bit later as we talk about some of the interactions we've had as a community. But those last 2 components of the CSF, which is respond and recover, that's been a key focus for us because as a community, as a financial services community, we know we're going to be attacked. There was a British study of businesses that was released last week that said 46% of all businesses in the UK had been attacked. Left me wondering what the other 54% were thinking about, quite frankly. So having the awareness and the recognition that you're going to be attacked, as a company, we're attacked hundreds of thousands of times per month. That equates to about a couple of dozen incidents per month. Understanding that you're going to be attacked, there's heavy motivation to attack companies like CME and Morgan Stanley. But having the ability to quickly detect those attacks at a very granular level, being able to respond effectively to those attacks, and then making sure that you have resiliency programs built in so that you can recover from those, what I call inevitable attacks.
Sure, and I think the one thing I think we wanted to add when we talk about the threat, and this goes to what we're seeing in these studies and such, is that it's becoming a more dangerous landscape out there. We're already a target. There's increasing I think situations where we are becoming more of a target. We've always been one because of naturally from a criminal element, the banks are where the money is. That's where theft occurs. But then you also see the evolution of geopolitical means in regards to are the financial services sector a proxy because of critical infrastructure? Where do we stand on that? And this goes into a lot of discussions we've had with the current administration, with DHS, with FBI in regards to protection of critical infrastructure and the need for kind of the U.S. government as well as other world governments to really look at this and say how do you protect those critical assets that really underlie the entire global economy and our ability to operate in safety, soundness, all those sorts of things. So I think this is we're seeing the firms are taking this very, very seriously. This is a board level issue at almost every firm out there. Firms are spending money, adding teams, adding technology in order to make sure that they're taking it risk mitigation very seriously. Also looking at their underlying infrastructure to ensure that, we're looking at what vulnerabilities we have and how do we make sure, we are not providing any kind of easy targets out there for attackers. So, you have that combination. Again, it goes
Sorry,
back
Carl,
to the
could you move
framework.
closer to the
Oh, sorry,
microphone?
and it goes back to the framework of, looking at it across the whole spectrum of, looking at our infrastructure. How do we protect, detect, and then if something were to happen, how do we make sure we mitigate the impacts?
The typical way we consider harms in our cybersecurity world for any industry is breaking it down into harms against confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And I think there has been a change in the dynamics of what we're seeing from the threat landscape. Initially, we saw much more in terms of harms to confidentiality. So, credentials, for example, being stolen in order to commit fraud. We still see that, of course. In fact, some of the more recent large-scale intrusions that have occurred in the financial services sector remain exactly for that reason, because it's where the money is, and credential harvesting still occurs, and typically is focused against the consumer, not the better protected institution. Integrity is an area of concern. When records might be altered, and the institutions certainly have spent a lot of time and attention being able to what I would call roll back transactions, understanding log records, understanding how the money is moving, which is increasingly important. I don't have to remind anybody here that that our financial system is based on zeros and ones, but not zeros as in no money and ones as in dollar bills. I heard someone express it this way to a group that was not as sophisticated in finance. They said, we all know that there's no longer a gold standard for our financial system, meaning there's no bar of gold somewhere that represents all of our dollars. What most people don't recognize is there's no dollar that represents every one of our dollars. And that shows the issue of integrity that the institutions have taken quite seriously. And the last is this notion of access and availability, the ability to bring down systems for a certain period of time. We see the banking and finance sector focused on each of these, and each of these as a focus not merely of low-level hackers. That's another area that I think has changed in the threat landscape. At the beginning, we were always concerned about the single individual hacker. I think to some extent that may have been fostered by movies like War Games, where you think it's one person in a basement somewhere. But that quickly emerged that organized crime in this area became not only big business, but logistically incredibly sophisticated. And I would point to the ATM hacks that we've seen on a number of occasions, moving in excess of $40 million in a 24-hour period by breaking into banks, by altering fraud detection schemes, allowing transactions to occur in excess of otherwise controlled limits, making sure money still remains in accounts so that the limit of the amount of money that could be taken out in an ATM is really just the amount of money in the ATM. But seeing that take place in 12 countries and over 100 cities at once with tens of thousands of transactions, where individuals on the ground are reporting money back up, going through no fewer than 10 different organizational capability sets, right? This is big business. And more recently, when we're talking about Bangladesh and the SWIFT incident there, and reports that that was nation-state sponsored, that we now have nations that are robbing banks, is something I believe nobody in this room that represents the private sector ever signed up for. Which does bring us to an important question, especially from a regulatory perspective, which I hope we can get more into today, which is whether the notion of regulating institutions to try to defend and protect themselves continuously against nation-level threats and organized crime groups is really ultimately a fool's errand that we could afford to continue with. No doubt, enterprises have to provide modest and reasonable protections. But we really do have to question our strategy, whether a vulnerability mitigation scheme, rather than the country itself protecting against advanced threat actors, rather than figuring out if we could mitigate some of these harms at a much higher level in the internet ecosystem before they ever reach the banks, whether we can talk about the design of equipment, software, hardware, firmware that's more transparent in the security rules that they apply to make security easier, whether metrics can be driven across industries with the help of the government. These are areas that it would do well for us to look at so that we don't keep putting the burden of cybersecurity on the private sector and the end users.
Very interesting comment, Steve. Brings us to the last question, because it's obviously something that we all share, regardless of who you are in the financial services. We all share a concern in this area. How is the industry collaborating in order to respond to cyber threats?
Sure. So the industry's we have a long history of working with each other and working with the government to look at not only cybersecurity but physical risks to the sector. So really, the two main entities that we've formed, and they've been around for about 15 years, is the FS-ISAC, which is the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center, and the FISIC, which is the Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council. So those two entities working hand in hand with their government partners, this would be the FIBIC, which the CFTC is a member of. This is really kind of the underpinning of how we work and collaborate, not only with each other, but with the government. We work, at least in Morgan Stanley, we are in collaboration with our partners and with other firms on a daily basis, sharing information, understanding what's going on, what threat intelligence they're seeing, what is going on in a like Stephen had said, in an increasingly dangerous world out there. We also collaborate extensively with FBI, Department of Homeland Security, Secret Service, and our sector-specific agency, the Treasury Department. So, kind of with that, we find that the ability to share information rapidly is an absolute essential piece to understanding where we need to focus our energies, focus our resources, and make sure that we're protecting our firms and our clients as adequately as possible. This is also an area that is a non-competitive one. Every firm looks at it as, an attack against one's attack against the sector. It affects the trust that underlies financial services. Hence, we do, everything in our powers to make sure that firms are protected overall and the sector is protected overall. And, that extends obviously into all of our financial utilities and all of our partners. So that's kind of been the history. Where we've gotten to more recently over the last couple of months is standing up a new entity called the FSARC. So this is the Financial Services Analysis and Resiliency Center. This is focused at critical infrastructure. So via Executive Order 13636, any firm, we have a set of firms that have been designated by DHS and the U.S. government as critical infrastructure within financial services as well as other sectors. And we've been working together to make sure that, kind of the entities that control kind of the critical infrastructure of financial services are, kind of going that extra mile to make sure they're protected, sharing information, and doing some advanced collaboration. So, that's an entity that's just kind of getting out of the gate here recently. We expect much more of that in this coming year. But, sharing is absolutely, again, underpinning and essential to what we do.
If I could just jump in here about the FSARC, we're excited as a community to have the ability to collaborate, but to collaborate in a way that brings those that have more skin in the game together. The FS-ISAC is an organization that allows, I think it's more than 5,000 financial organizations globally to come together and share information, sometimes in an automated way. The FSARC, the Financial Systemic Analysis and Resiliency Center, allows the 8 global systemically important banks and the systemically important market financial utilities like CME and DTCC and ICE to come together in a smaller group to talk about cyber as it relates to systemic risk. And I think this is really kind of the leap forward in our community that allows us to start identifying those systemic vulnerabilities across finance working with Treasury and other regulators to, I'm an Army veteran, so I believe that you fight like you train. And our training is these national level exercises, the Hamilton series of exercises that are continuing, that allow us to really examine what's vulnerable in our ecosystem and how we would collectively respond to it, not on a firm basis, but on a community basis. And I think the FSARC is going to be key as that stands up to pushing our capabilities forward in that regard.
I wanted to echo the view of the importance of the FSARC, and in light of the incredible work that the FSISAC has done to this point, there's no doubt in my mind, and based on my prior experience, which includes over 15 years of service with the FBI, where I had actually built and led the FBI Cyber Intelligence Program and later served as deputy of the FBI Cyber Division. The financial services does information sharing better than any industry group out there. What I think the FSARC is bringing to this is an additional layer of strategy that otherwise can be eaten up by the day-to-day tactics that are involved in cybersecurity. To put a finer point on that, I think that a lot of times we talk about information sharing as though it were in and of itself a worthy goal. Right? How's information sharing? What is information sharing? And I've spoken with other sector groups that I think are not as sophisticated as the financial services sector in this regard. Some who require their members to provide information in order to get information, for example. And really, at the end of the day, we should be looking to see if there are any barriers to information sharing. But ultimately, we're trying to solve problems, and it's a lot better to say what are the biggest problems that the industry is facing, and then what is the least amount of information and the fewest number of members that would be needed to be able to analyze and come up with an answer that could be used for the benefit of the sector as a whole. And to the extent there's a free rider problem in that, which I greatly admit that there would be, then some people will just have to pay for the solution. But the answer is not otherwise. Let's see how much information we could push around from one group to the other. And I find it discouraging when I hear groups, including the government, just ask for more information to be shared without really an understanding of what the end goal is of that. Information sharing is one means, and there are other means, of course, as well, to understanding how to make the environment more secure, more resilient, and to make sure that threat actors ultimately are deterred from trying these actions in the first place.
Thank you, Steve. Well, there's a lot to digest here, so I'd like to throw it open for questions. If you have a question, please move your card. Well, I have one question. What would you expect, what would you look for from regulators like the CFTC to help in this effort?
A few things. We are very appreciative with regard to the new rulemaking and regulation that came out late last year with regard to system safeguard testing. We agree that, and we've commented on this heavily, we agree that the approach, the principles-based approach to regulation is really the approach that supports true risk-managed and risk-informed success in this area. What we see globally is sort of a drifting away of those principles-based approaches to regulation. Some of the regulation that's pending is very prescriptive, which may not drive risk in the direction that we all want it to go. So the continued focus on principles-based regulation in this area, I think, is going to be helpful for the quite different large firms and financial services to manage the risk.
Yeah, an item I'd add to that, I think, is as we talked about information sharing collaboration, is we do across the private side. I think having at least the U.S. regulators collaborate with each other, I think, is really important. We have this notion, and we're starting to champion out there through FISIC and FSISAC of regulatory harmonization. The idea that in many cases regulators are asking not only in the U.S. but globally for a lot of the same things, but just in slightly different ways. So just finding ways that we can do that in a really efficient process would be incredibly helpful. Because at the end of the day, obviously compliance is kind of that's table stakes here. That's just for, kind of getting in the game and our expectations. But risk management is ultimately where we want to get to. And so, how do we, going to Gil's point, using principles that underlie or allow really a one-size-fits-all approach not to occur. And then also working, I think, through bodies like IOSCO from a global standpoint that we can say, kind of how do we pull together all of the, in that case, the securities regulators to, maybe take one or, maybe a few approaches versus, many approaches to this situation.
Well, I would add one thing and echo a second. The point I would like to add is that it may, in fact, be time for the regulators to question whether the strategy is actually correct that the U.S. is pursuing, which was pursuant to my earlier comment. Ultimately, I think it is a failed strategy to believe that the end users, including critical infrastructure owners and operators and the financial institutions, have a sustainable plan from a risk management point of view that will protect our country and the banking and finance system included within that. I think we have to move this away from the end users, and I think that the regulators can actually step up and actually kind of look down on what we're all doing. This is not in any way a critique of what the regulators are doing. In fact, the CFTC and the federal regulators have done a better job in regulating and looking towards risk management principles than many others. Still, the question remains whether or not that approach, no matter how well pursued, is actually the right approach. And I would urge the Commission to become part of a larger debate of whether there is room for greater threat deterrence and for more involvement by the Internet ecosystem to get rid of threats and vulnerabilities at a higher level, to move towards better metrics involved in what's working as against the threat, and to be involved in more transparency in the creation design of software and hardware that we are all reliant upon. So I think there's actually another strategy that the Commission can be part of, another broader dialogue that ultimately is important. The second is, although the federal regulators have actually done a very good job of looking towards harmonization, we now see New York State and the Department of Financial Services getting into the mix in a way that is not consistent with what is otherwise being done. And in fact, in recent comments by New York State, they actually said that in their view, a risk assessment should not include a cost-benefit analysis when it comes to accepting or mitigating cybersecurity risk. That does not seem to comport with basic concepts of enterprise risk management. And the possibility that other states will take suit and will also become a federated view of cybersecurity similar to what we're seeing in the data breach notification realm would not be beneficial to consumers in the end run. Businesses need consistency and an understanding of where to focus their resources, and we need to move forward in concept and in terms of tactics and strategy. So I do believe that this Commission, as well as other regulators, need to, as has been discussed, think of harmonization, unfortunately, even broader than the federal regulators.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one question. I've just been told, so Anat?
Find it very interesting discussion because I do think cybersecurity is an enormous risk, but particularly found fascinating the question of whose problem exactly it is and whether it's sort of private sector or public sector. So a couple of comments. First of all, there have been a lot of mergers in banking, and I hear from sources within that IT systems have not been really streamlined, and that IT is kind of in some of the ones that have had lots and lots of mergers over the years are balkanized and hard to find information. So those are things at that level. So that's question one. And question two and comment has to do with your comment, Steve, about how it's a broader problem. It's a public, it's a sort of collective action problem, and there are all these jurisdictions and all these public sector and private sector actors. And so I think it is ironic right here in CFTC, which is probably the poorest of regulators, to throw at other people without, all of us here lobbying for some federal government or somebody to take this on, as opposed to pass it on from one party to the other. I would say that the private sector often has more resources than the public sector, or somebody's in the public sector, to do stuff. So obviously collaboration is critical, but just that.
I comment on your second point, although not the first, because I wouldn't be aware of the balkanization issue that companies are seeing. I agree with you entirely that if we're going to get this right, it's going to require the private sector and indeed an international effort to understand how best to resolve this. And I do think that with the resources that the private sector has, certainly in terms of strategy and will, that a lot could be advanced on where we should recommend our next steps in coordination with the government.
I'm afraid we'll have to leave it at that. Very interesting discussion. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. We'll take a 10-minute break and start again about 11:35.
It's not just the ISPs, right? So the whole internet ecosystem that is essentially at a higher level, where tier one level, where all of the hacking is flowing through before it gets to the station. And so, and to think about ways to get all of those providers paid to make that an economic incentive for them to choose to be able to safety systems, so for example, identify hacking methods at a higher level.
We're going to start in about 2 minutes. Please come back to your seats if you can. I'm going to start in about a minute.
Want them getting riled up. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, okay, no problem.
All right, so it's around 11:40, and we're ending at 1:20. Okay. Instead of 11:30. All right. It is my pleasure to call this meeting back to order. As noted in today's agenda, our third panel discussion will be on the state of the market. I would like to introduce Mr. John Nixon, Senior Advisor for NEX, who will facilitate and help shape the discussions during this third panel.
Thank you. Welcome all back. I'd also like to offer my thanks to Acting Chairman Giancarlo and Commissioner Bowen, as well as to Petal for all the work that they've done in putting this together, and many thanks to all of the MRAC committee members who have taken the time to be here today. We don't have any speakers for the session today. We've asked a few people who are members to help initiate some of the discussion on each of the topics, but obviously all of you are welcome to join, and any of the topics, just please raise your name card and we will call you out. We'll speak for probably about 15 minutes on each of the topics, leaving some time for any closing remarks and any other question or any other topics that the MREC members might want to bring up. The questions today, all of you have them. Just to let you know, these are the questions that were submitted to the MREC committee by the CFTC. They are their areas of interest, their topics that they would like to hear from the MREC committee. So if you don't like any of the questions, don't blame the facilitator because I didn't come up with them. So let's start with the first question on volatility events. How did the markets cope with the recent volatility events, particularly around Brexit and the US election? What are some of the concerns that your organizations have about the potential short-term and long-term consequences of these volatility events? How are you preparing? How are we coping? If I could just, don't mind calling on Christian Walters to perhaps start us off. and then we'll just open it up to everybody else to join into the discussion.
Sure. Can everyone hear me okay? So I would say from a short-term perspective, particularly with regard to liquidity, both recent events, the U.S. election as well as Brexit, were addressed effectively by markets. We were surprised by the outcome, but certainly markets were able to adapt and address. I would say more broadly, there's been a very significant kind of change in market volatility and how it presents itself in financial markets. So at least from my perspective, for many, many years before the financial crisis, developed market behavior, economic policy in developed markets was highly homogeneous. And unlike emerging markets where there was lots of heterogeneity and market shocks caused by economic policy, we just didn't see that in developed markets. And in general, from a risk management perspective, statistical models and stress testing could be used to kind of reasonably estimate the impact on P&L and portfolios and alpha in adverse market conditions. I think, starting with the financial crisis, post-financial crisis with, very significant monetary policy intervention for many years, the nature of, structurally the nature of markets has changed, and they appear to be structurally much more susceptible to economic policy shocks. So in today's markets, particularly with the rise of populism in the UK, the US, and continental Europe, what you tend to see are markets or economies and markets that are quite heterogeneous from an economic policy perspective, which I think has resulted in the markets appearing to be benign for very long periods of time. So you'll see situations where volatility has been very, very low, in fact, encouraged by monetary policy and kind of real negative rates for a prolonged period of time. But the markets are very susceptible to economic policy shocks and large movements to the downside on economic policy surprises. So I think from our perspective, as a risk manager, what I do and what my team does globally is we spend a lot of time working with economists and investors across the firm talking about what events could potentially occur. And instead of defining a single event and a set of outcomes, such as Brexit, what we'll do is we'll look at varying permutations of an event that could unfold. So, currently, I think, recently it's looking more and more like a hard Brexit might occur, but we run models against our portfolios to look at the impact of varying outcomes as the UK starts to separate from the European Union. What it means is it's more difficult to measure risk, and there are a lot more surprises that are significant multiple standard deviation moves that we've ever seen in the past. I guess the last comment on Brexit in particular is that it does appear that the market reacted quite significantly on the downside. UK equities, property, and the currency itself. I think potentially there could be more volatility on a hard Brexit, but the real concern that we have is the long-term impact on the UK economy. There have been some, I think Her Majesty's Treasury did a study before Brexit, and there was a view that GDP could fall between 6 and 7.5% in the event of Brexit, which would make the UK a much, a poorer country in that event. So I think that's our concern specifically with regard to Brexit.
Kristen, traditionally in our markets we oversee at the CFTC, futures and swaps, there's a fair amount of correlation, heightened activity levels, say in futures, say interest rate futures would also see heightened activity levels in swaps. we watched the Brexit event from our perspective here in Washington very carefully. And one of the things that was actually somewhat remarkable was the activity levels in futures, including interest rate futures, were heightened. Actually, in the wake of Brexit, activities in the correlated swaps were actually fairly quiet. Question, does that actually cause to question whether market participants, in the wake of the new information provided by the Brexit vote, in reassessing their portfolios, perhaps may have been reluctant to engage in products that had been subject to reg reform, in particular Dodd-Frank, and chose to participate in markets that were subject to, say, more longstanding traditional regulation like the futures market, or unregulated as in currency markets? Is there something about the quietness we saw in the swaps markets following Brexit that may actually say perhaps the market's comfort level with some of the changes that have been made?
I mean, from my personal perspective, I don't think so, but you definitely raise an interesting point. I think we definitely see in times of market stress much more activity in the most liquid instruments. So certainly in our active, I mean, you'll see lots of flows in ETFs, for instance, in adverse market environments on the equity and fixed income side. And it's not surprising that you would see increased futures activity with many market participants taking views on the rate side via futures. Why the lack of activity in swaps, I don't know. From BlackRock's perspective, I think we nearly 97-ish% of any derivatives that we transact in on behalf of our clients' accounts are either in futures markets or centrally cleared. We have viewed clearing of swaps to be a very significant plus for financial markets and as a risk reduction tool overall. The only point I would make about liquidity is I certainly share Bob Wasserman and others' concerns about liquidity issues and portability given regulatory capital requirements and leverage. So I do view that particular issue as an added risk from a liquidity perspective to markets. I guess I would leave it, see if others have comments on swaps versus futures post-Brexit.
Jerry, do you have something you might want to add?
No, I mean, I think some of our commenters are thinking about the swaps versus futures point. From our vantage point, I think one of the primary concerns have been, would you see a aberration in terms of the liquidity available across the different CEFs in the way either leading into Brexit or post-Brexit? And from our standpoint, I think that we saw a very resilient amount of liquidity available on the CEFs that for those that wanted to trade the swap market, they were able to do so, I think, very resiliently.
Sunil?
I think I wouldn't be answering Chairman's question, but I would just be acknowledging a few things. One is for both those events, what we noticed was very high liquidity during the Asian and the European time zones. And these were well-anticipated events. I think at least for Brexit, we were quite aware of the fact that a lot of traders, even in the European time zone, had positioned themselves to participate during the Asian time zone immediately post the results were published. So that is one factor. The second is we saw significant volatility in the Asian time zone, especially in the Nikkei contract. We saw a lot of activity in safe assets, gold and treasury futures, FX, especially the sterling and the euro moving, and then finally, treasuries rallying significantly. So as Kristen pointed out, I think liquidity is basically an evolving thing throughout the 24-hour time zone, and we noticed that a lot of traders were actively participating in the futures markets at that time. From a risk perspective, that is us CCPs, that's how we look at things. From a risk perspective, these were anticipated events that we could prepare for, just like Kristen pointed out. And I think CCPs across the board were preparing for them well in advance. It holds true for this year as well. We have a lot of elections that can, to Kristen's point, create or inject more volatility into the market. And I think from a risk manager's perspective, you cannot bias your views on one or another outcome. You have to prepare yourself for any outcome. And that has been the focus for us CCPs. The second focus for us as CCPs is to make sure that we don't create unanticipated demands on our clearing members as well as our clients in terms of liquidity. That's a very important thing to keep in mind, because a CCP cannot think of itself, but it has to think of the entire ecosystem. And I think the markets performed very well throughout both those events. I think the CCP actions were very measured throughout both those events. And as CCPs, we stand prepared for the events to come as well. And that is what we have to look forward to for the rest of this year until September.
Dennis.
Thank you. I'd just like to add where we go now from where we are. So Brexit has happened. The CCPs all managed to get through it. The market got through it. But there's increasing noise, especially in Europe, about clearing euro products on the continent. And from a risk management perspective, that raises a lot of concerns. The biggest concern I have is that once you artificially fracture a global liquidity pool, for example, as we have in swaps, you then have less members to bid on a defaulted member's portfolio. You have less members to which you could actually port a client portfolio. You have less members who are involved in the assessments that could happen. You have less members around which to share the losses from variation margin gains haircutting, and you have less members to basically at every step of the waterfall as you move down, you have a worse position than you had before. So that increases the systemic risk, and this is one of the big concerns I have.
Before we go on to the next question, can I open it up to a couple of the other members? Maybe one of the banks could give their view.
So, John, thank you. To kind of directly address Acting Chair's question, I'd like to pick up on, I think, something Sunil was alluding to, is the fact that there are fragmentations in end participant in futures, while there is overlap between futures participants and interest rate swap participants. I think the timing of when the event occurs is very relevant as to who can react to it. For example, Brexit, the final news came out pretty much very late night during US hours. Most of the market participants, while they may have staffed their desks overnight, which is a usually a normal event, the markets in Asia were open. And because we do see a concentration of, let's say, swaps trading based on regional and kind of CEF rules, the swap market wasn't really up and alive at like 2 a.m. New York time, whereas the futures market were open for business in Asia. And that, being in the middle of the day, you kind of started seeing the activity. Same thing happened with the U.S. election results. The results were coming around 3 a.m., 4 a.m. And while, again, desks were unusually staffed to prepare for such an event, markets in Asia, markets in Europe were ready and opening. So by the time the regional focus on the US dollar swap market starts to happen, whether it's US dollar swaps or CDX, the markets in Asia have already led the processing of the event, and the volatility is kind of dampened as the market opens. So these may be some of the reasons why, sitting at a market maker or a bank, we see these events already playing out, and people's expectations or their concerns around these events dampened a little bit already.
Maybe we could use that as a segue into the second topic around, which has already really been talked a little bit about, around liquidity on the CEFs or liquidity on any of the venues. I'd just like to hear some comments from the MREC members about the liquidity issues that they may have faced either during times of stress, or are there any liquidity issues now that you are concerned about that you'd like to share with the CFTC? There's one thing that I think I would note, that during the Brexit situation, the markets, obviously particularly the currency markets around sterling, were extremely volatile for a day. And then that volatility subsided pretty quickly. It seems to me that a lot of these liquidity events seem to happen in a very short window, or liquidity stress events happen in a very short window, and the markets have a tendency to calm down very quickly. But I'd just like to open that up and get some more views from the MREC members on the state of liquidity in the marketplace, both on a regular basis, but obviously in times of stress. Biz, you want to take one more crack at that?
Sure. So, John, thank you again for the opportunity, and thank you, Acting Chair, Commissioner, and Petal for setting up the discussion. I think I wouldn't want to blame anyone. I think these are very excellent topics that have been chosen. So, as we at Citi look at the CEF market and the liquidity available, we approach the market as principal market makers, looking to satisfy the risk needs that our end users, some of them who are here around the table, might have. In our experience over the last 2-3 years, as we look at the CEF regime, mostly across the interest rate swap and the credit default swap markets, we think it is working satisfactorily. And when I mention satisfactorily, I think from a normal day-to-day functioning, people seem to be able to get their needs. They seem to be able to meet their needs around their liquidity, their risk, whether that's standardized or non-standardized. We do see the CEF regime as a marketplace where many CEF options do exist, but liquidity or the actual trading volume seems to coalesce around a few kind of venues. It is a little more concentrated in the credit default swap market with 1 or 2 venues, whereas in the interest rate swap market, that is probably spread out more over 3 to 4 venues, and that seems to be a consistent trend and not changing. Why is it the fact that you see this kind of construct and this concentration of CEFs versus something like equities, which is a much more widely traded product across multiple venues? And I think that goes back to the comment I mentioned earlier on the Brexit, is the more concentration of participants in a product class, the tendency for it to trade on fewer venues. So, for example, if you compare the asset classes of credit default swaps and interest rate swaps, you clearly see it's a smaller marketplace in terms of number of participants and the volume that's transacted. Hence, the fragmentation across venues is much lesser, and that number grows as you move from the least concentrated asset classes to the more concentrated asset classes. We do acknowledge and accept, and I think Kristen alluded to it, that stressed market conditions will occur. And stressed market conditions will occur, and I think the market, looking at the CEF construct, has been living with the comfort that these have been rare, and when they're rare, as John mentioned, the volatility and the stress conditions seem to be dying out on their own fairly quickly. They're not lasting over multiple days or weeks. However, we do think that the CEF rules by themselves or the event that happens, how soon the volatility dies out, I don't think is aided by the CEF rules. That probably points more to the construct of who are the nature of the market participants, and to the extent that there are people that can warehouse the risk and have the incentive to be the end user or the end provider of risk, that seems to be more, and their capacity seems to be the larger reason why some of these events die out much faster. So, that is our observations, that, the CEF construct and the rule set as itself does not, help or hurt to, dampen the liquidity or the volatility. As I said, we see flexibility in the availability of CEF regimes. We welcome that. However, we should understand that having multiple venues connected to multiple SDRs, connected to multiple CCPs, does create kind of a complex web. And if everybody's ability to access these markets, if everybody's ability to have equal resources to be available to connect to these markets, if that were truly a level playing field, then you probably see more trading and flexibility across these venues. However, we know that every market participant is different, and to the extent that market participants have varying amount of resources to be able to support all these platforms, all these connectivity venues, you definitely see them coalescing around fewer venues, because there is a certain cost to be able to trade on every venue, to be able to connect it to every venue. So that kind of takes me down the path as we look at the CEF construct, is there room for improvement? Can something be done? And I think the first area we'd like to point to, which is something I think the Commission in the past has looked at, is to make sure we have certain basic guidelines for robustness and operational capabilities that the CEF support. One of the other areas of concern is that the CEF just has one method of connecting to a part of the chain, which is a clearinghouse or maybe an SDR. And we welcome CEFs, and some of them are on the table, to reflect on the fact that they do have backup systems of connectivity and processing and operational standards that would allow them, in the case of a failure in one of these connectivity components, to be able to process the trades and not bring the markets to a standstill. The other area, which is again been a big area of focus, is cross-border harmonization, and we welcome the Commission's efforts to reach out to other jurisdictions. Case in point was very evident when the CEF rules went into place a few years ago. We immediately saw a bifurcation of the market between US CEFs and non-CEFs, and it certainly is a concern for us, and it is certainly a concern for our customers. And to the extent that people don't have either the ability or the resources to immediately connect to different regimes and support regimes, or there are political or regulatory boundaries that prevent, and we certainly saw that we had the experience that there were certain non-CEF markets that prevented US participants from joining them. And I think the Commission should definitely work to ensure that that doesn't happen. And finally, we do welcome a continuous evaluation of the CEF regime, because it's not like these rules are set in stone. So we welcome the opportunity for the market to be involved with the Commission and looking at CEF rules, expanding product requirements, bringing more products to it. But we think that any changes or modifications, because it certainly places a large burden on the market to adapt to new products and new rules, should be done in the light of harming or helping liquidity, and should definitely have a cost-benefit analysis associated with it.
Okay, Jerry, can I turn to you there? And then Sebastian, maybe?
For sake of compartmentalizing, I'll defer to Richard, because my comments relate to the commodities market as opposed to rates and CDS. So it's up to you, John. Go ahead. All right. I prepared some remarks, which are my own remarks, and reflecting from a non-banking perspective, and related specifically to the commodities markets, that being eggs, energy, and non-interest rate, non-CDS, to give a little bit different vantage point. From a liquidity standpoint, the market remains in a state of non-CEF, still an OTC marketplace in the commodity space. And to that end, the number one item on the list that is impacting liquidity is the $8 billion de minimis ratchet down to the $3 billion. Continues to reduce liquidity in the commodity space. Lack of action on the part of the Commission to affirm the $8 billion is as an appropriate threshold level for non-bank dealers is keeping market activity to a minimum and is hurting commercial end users. We continue to see the result through bankruptcies, citing the Westinghouse bankruptcy here, $8 billion bankruptcy, as well as many of the bankruptcies occurring in the upstream oil area, both due to lack of hedging in connection with lower prices in those commodity sectors. The policy objectives of the Commission is to increase participation and competition in the markets. It regulates without fear of participants incurring costs of registration and regulation, citing the CFTC staff report from 2015 relating to the preliminary report on swap dealing threshold. There's a need for legal certainty, and maintaining that $8 billion threshold, according to that preliminary report, would create some legal certainty. Moreover, the report refers to the registration goal has already been met. 80% of the commodity swaps markets already deal with a dealer on one side or another. The report goes on to state over 3,400 non-financial, non-registered entities traded swaps between Q2 14 and Q1 15. The vast majority of the dealers are financial entities. Only 12 unregistered entities traded over 5,000 swaps in that same year. The Commission inaction and having a negative impact on the material percentage of that 3,400 non-financial swap users from transacting swaps of any size or frequency. I ask the Commission, does it make sense for the Commission to continue to impose a ratchet down to capture nearly 12 non-financial firms that trade in excess of 5,000 swaps annually? Why not approach the 12 entities and simply ask them why they are not registered and save the other 3,400 prospective swap end users, non-financial businesses, from the costs associated with being a dealer? Those costs are registration, business conduct compliance, reporting, record keeping, risk management requirements, legal compliance requirements, legal disclosures, forced CCO employment, and material capital set-asides. Or face the prospect of leaving the commodity swap markets or artificially capping its activity. Before this special entity threshold was fixed a few years ago, there was a special entity that testified at the APPA testimony in front of the House Ag Committee in March of 2013 that 2/3 of its counterparties had diminished or had otherwise gone away, mitigating any ability to hedge its risk. Commissioner Bowen recently gave a speech at the Eurofi high-level seminar in Amsterdam, and quoting from her speech quite eloquently here, we can better achieve our purposes as regulators to incentivize the formation of efficient, transparent, well-collateralized markets that are safe for counterparties. To do less is to fail to do our jobs. I assert that failure to maintain the legal and regulatory certainty of an $8 billion threshold is a failure of the Commission to do its jobs for the commodity swaps markets. I'm sure that the current commissioners and its staff have no interest in failing the commodity swaps markets. However, just to maintain the $8 billion threshold is not enough. The Commission has also proposed the capital rule for non-swap bank dealers, so those non-banks who might want to be a dealer, that is due for comment in mid-May. So I think this is a very timely panel to talk about liquidity, which the number one issue is obviously capital set aside. The former capital rule, along with the regulatory threat of the $8 billion ratchet down, now have been the largest bars to entry in the commodity swap dealing space. New capital rules now that have been proposed are very welcome additions. For those who haven't read them, it's a draft that's been out there for probably about 3 or 4 months, but the former rule was from 2012. The new rule is introduced what has never been introduced before, which is a tangible net worth test for non-bank dealers. Very insightful and welcome addition, but there's questions that remain. There's a 3-part test to the tangible net worth. $20 million plus market risk charges and or credit risk charges, or 8% of uncleared swap margin plus initial margin for cleared futures, or a referral to or a deferment to the Registered Futures Association, which is the NFA. The questions are as follows. Is it up to the industry to define the best practice, or will the Commission provide some type of guidance with regard to credit and market risk charges? The draft rule refers to a standard deduction under Reg 1.17. However, that standard rule is not clear from an end user or commodity market participant standpoint. So the process for approval of an internal capital model is another question. Will there be really a process, or is that something that the firms can use their own business judgment to render? Alternatively, one can turn to 8% of swap margin calculation but is that determined off the gross notional of swaps? Or is it related to any letters of credit or parent guarantees? Many of the folks in the commodity space deal with LCs or PGs, and is 8% calculation off of those posted letters of credit sufficient? Does the 8% have a subordinated debt sufficiency in it one way or another? Some of these questions aren't answered, of course, in the draft rule, but hopefully over time we're able to get at them to create some clarity, some legal clarity for those that might want to get involved in the swaps commodities market. As also noted by Commissioner Bowen earlier in her speech, financial stability, but applying a capital penalty is counterproductive and risks driving transactions back into the darkness of the markets. Surely the new capital rule cannot be meant to be a penalty or prospective non-bank commodity dealers. Presently, there's very few based on the study that staff has put forth. Without more clarity, the capital rule and the commodity firms that might choose to become dealers are unable to grow in a productive or create any sort of liquidity in what is otherwise a shrinking market. One other point being is the 3,400 non-bank commodity participants were in no way part of the making of the 2008 financial housing crisis and should not now be penalized by a forced regulatory cost or forced registration due to a failure of the Commission to maintain the $8 billion threshold or establish clear capital rules for non-bank dealers. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. Sebastian, can I call on you for a second?
Sure. I was focused more on answering the chairman's question with regards to the liquidity in the markets, especially during the distressed events. So I will confirm what I heard a couple of people say already. Indeed, we prepared to provide liquidity throughout the night from our U.S. operations as well as from our Asian and European operations. And because of the fact that futures markets are open pretty much 24 hours, I feel the markets are able to absorb whatever the volatility is coming from these events pretty fast. We do indeed notice that the liquidity typically sits in the most liquid products. So looking at the 10-year Treasury and the S&P options, if we look at the index options, looking at the smaller indices, the liquidity there is a lot smaller. We try to provide liquidity, but the necessity for that seems to be a lot lower during the first couple of hours after events with unexpected outcomes have happened. So looking at the liquidity, I actually think the markets work really well being able to get these volatile events priced in relatively fast. And I know I will have some more things to say because it's already been mentioned a couple of times. One of the biggest problems that we see with regards to liquidity is the leverage ratio problem that keeps coming up more and more. It's actively impacting competitors. We have a lot of talk about that because it becomes harder and harder to actually provide liquidity, not just from the bank side, but also from proprietary trading firms and market makers like ourselves that use clearing at the different banks, because it's virtually impossible to get more room on their balance sheet, which just means we either have to widen prices or we are less able to provide liquidity in all the months that are out there.
Thanks, Sebastian. We are going to come back to the leverage ratio, and I'm sure that there'll be a lot of comments in regards to that. Just moving for a second to the interest rate environment. The CFTC has asked what changes you guys might expect to see as the interest rates begin to rise. Do you have any particular concerns around stress in the marketplace as interest rates begin to take a course or direction that they haven't taken in a long period of time? I open that up. Ed, do you want to take a crack at Biz?
Yeah, thank you, John. As we look at the interest rate environment that exists across the world, we like to break it up into three regions. The first being the U.S., then obviously the European zone, and then Japan. We do see in the marketplace interactions of participants across these three regions. In the U.S., obviously, our view is there is the monetary policy in effect. We do see, however, especially election and post-election, a counter effect coming from the proposed or the expected fiscal policy. And in our assessment, currently where it exists in the U.S. right now, the interest rate and the yield curve is trying to balance out the counter effect. And if I can elaborate, we see the effect of the monetary policy as laid out by the Fed to kind of raising short-term interest rates, but overall keeping the yield curve on a flatter basis. However, the expectation from the fiscal policy, and as the details begin to emerge from the new administration, we kind of see that as kind of steepening the yield curve, as the focus seems to be on longer-term growth. So we've been seeing this effect starting November onwards, where post-election and the kind of the sudden expectation for fiscal policy jumps seem to indicate that the yield curve would steepen. However, as details are emerging or have taken time to emerge, we kind of see the monetary policy starting to dominate again. So we expect this to continue. Overall, our expectation from our economists is that the current monetary policy in the U.S. leads to a 4 to 6 kind of rate hikes, kind of topping out near the 2.5% kind of regime, because we think the current growth rate in the U.S. probably supports interest rates up to that level. Moving on to Europe, our view is the ECB has probably reached the maximum of the QE that it was kind of expected. We do see signs of growth emerging from the European regime. However, the bigger issue in Europe seems to be the recent political kind of landscape that's emerging. We've slated for 3 large elections in Europe, and we're in the middle of one right now. And I think the policy in Europe will continue, and the rate environment in Europe will continue to get affected by the political environment. Moving on to Japan, we have observed, obviously, historically, very low interest rates there. And our expectation is that the focus on the policy continues to be more on maintaining the exchange rate and focusing on the exchange rate rather than on the interest rate. As a result, if you are looking at interest rate flows, we do see borrowing in yen getting converted to dollars and being invested in the US rate market. That was a large trade in the prior couple of years. And while there was a little, I would say, slowing down in that rate, we think that is picking up again. And so we expect the cycle of borrowing from Japan and investing in the US dollar market to kind of dominate the flows going forward.
Yeah, thank you, John. In the context of interest rates and the yield curve, it's probably appropriate to jump in on the comments I have with respect to the life insurers industry's ability to execute hedges in what are, in its case, long duration products, and the challenges that they're facing finding liquidity in those marketplaces, and the aggravating extra factor of the 15-minute delay in reporting that's allowed, which we think is not sufficient because of the liquidity concerns we're facing. Just to be a little bit more specific, life insurers are using the interest rate markets to hedge their long-dated risks. So they're often in the swaptions market and forward-starting swaps. These are not in the durations that they're trading. These are not very deep and liquid markets. And they cannot complete their hedges within the 15-minute reporting period. So after the trades are posted after the 15 minutes, they still have more to do. These are complex hedge activities, and the market dries up even further, and prices widen. And there's an extra aggravating factor that has become more evident in the ability of the dealers and other market participants to data mine the activity that's actually occurring in the market within the 15-minute period to see and discern that there is a block being worked in the marketplace, so that they know even within the 15 minutes that there's a big trade. And the second aggravating factor is that life insurers, unlike many other market participants, have fairly transparent portfolios because they're required to, by state regulators, to disclose their derivatives positions. And the banks can upload that data, and with the ability to data mine again, they can see what's going on perhaps after the 15 minutes, after the trades are reported, they can actually see who's in the marketplace and that there's trades being done that are reflective of the activities of a particular insurance company. So you have these these aggravating elements to the situation. And I'm mindful of the fact that under the CEA, we're supposed to have a block trading regime that accomplishes two things. The rules of the CFTC should accomplish two things, which are to maintain anonymity of the block trader and be capable of maintaining a liquid market, not have a material adverse effect on the liquidity of the market. And we question whether the 15-minute rule in the light of experience is accomplishing the objectives of the Act. And it's becoming a more apparent question, and we're raising it as a matter of market risk because the life insurers obviously are using these markets to hedge their risk. So I think it's an appropriate subject for discussion.
Thanks, Richard. Sunil, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I think the focus of my comments would be from a risk perspective. So as we heard from BIS, there are expectations in terms of monetary policy in different environments, especially in the US and in Europe and Japan. But from a risk perspective, we look at surprises to those expectations. So we get to see the commentary, but we also are cognizant of the fact that there are several other things that are happening in the market that may turn out to be surprises for these normal trends. So I think to Kristen's point earlier, one thing is for sure, volatility is here to stay, but it's not constant. It ebbs and flows. So in some cases, we see markets being far too complacent and then reacting as Kristen pointed out. So I think for a CCP and for a risk manager, that would be our primary focus when it comes to interest rate environment and the future.
Okay, thank you. I think we probably want to move on to the next question, which seems to be everybody's favorite topic, the leverage ratio. And I'd love to hear from obviously from the members of the committee, their views on the leverage ratio and the application and the impact that it's had on market efficiency. Annette, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. I've been sitting here waiting patiently. It's all the fault of the leverage ratio we hear, that poor ratio. Everybody's jumping on it. So let me try to put it in perspective about the hated leverage ratio. What is wrong with a lot of things that I see from where I am, and I'll make a comment about that later, is poorly designed regulations. So a lot of what I see is that result, and that includes the leverage ratio. I have some writing here, and I can speak to it for hours, because I've been thinking about it for almost a decade, about what's wrong with the way we design capital regulation, including leverage ratios. Now, I just want to remind us all that the ratios we're talking about are small, and that there are many ways to satisfy them. Now, you need room on your balance sheet, I hear, and all these things, but there can be an expansion of the balance sheet with retained earnings. Too. However, every unintended consequences to everything can often be traced to the way the regulation is implemented. In particular, in my writing, I haven't advocated a ratio at all, but more an amount of equity that one plays with, and also such a wide range to absorb losses that we're not responding to a ratio and being on that margin of that ratio. Because obviously stuff happens, stress happens, and and it's all about the dynamics and promptly intervening as stress builds up. The problem is that the system is so fragile that we immediately get nervous when there's a little bit of stress. I can elaborate on that. Now, a lot of words are thrown around, especially in this committee. There are obviously members of CCPs and other people, and then there are the CCPs, and it's interesting for me to watch when they disagree, but we all love liquidity. I was yesterday at Treasury, and we all love credit there. Love it. All these wonderful words, and level playing fields also, God can't have enough of all those great things. What my concern is, as an academic, as a non-interested party except for the public, is when markets get distorted, when things are mispriced. So we could have too much and too little of all these things, credit and liquidity and all of those things. They will go boom, they'll go bust. So the question is, why are they unstable, or why do they get mispriced? And again, it's the distorted incentive and the failure of regulation to control them. Now, maybe I've been in this committee from the start, but maybe it's a good time to, also in the spirit of the discussion of cybersecurity, in which we kind of came to the insight that is a collective action problem. I should mention maybe why I'm representing Better Markets, and just clarify that Better Markets is a nonprofit organization that's not paying me to be here. And as Petal knows, I couldn't be here representing the institution that is paying my salary to do this community service and be here, because my colleagues are not here and are doing other things that advance their careers. So I appreciate being here very much, but not for myself really. So anyway, let me just say, some rules are costly or inconvenient, but these days when we have from the very top, the mantra that regulations are costly, just that word, we have to always remember whose costs. So we're talking about when there are all kinds of rules, laws, and regulation. I don't want to go as basic as to say, it's inconvenient for us. It's happened to me to be caught, speeding, but we're not going to blame the speed limit for that ticket, and we would not lobby against certain speed limits. Most of them we accept as reasonable. So I think that's kind of a good analogy. So anyway, to summarize, I think the leverage ratio as implemented is poorly designed. The regulations related to them are inadequate, and I know how to improve them. And if they have unintended consequences that are bad, then we should discuss it, because the intention of people like me is not to constrain all the good stuff that we should have, but to get everything working efficiently without transferring risk to the public. That's all.
Luke.
Thank you. In responding to this question, I offer the perspective as a firm that has historically represented the buy side. The buy side, including end users, which in most cases is not directly subject to capital requirements and doesn't customarily undertake capital calculations. It's not always best positioned to identify the exact sorts of difficulties they observe in the marketplace. However, the buy side is well positioned to speak to the difficulties themselves and to invite scrutiny about whether those difficulties are proportional to the benefits of a given policy. On this score, we can very comfortably assert that central clearing is expensive. I have spoken to this committee before about those expenses, with an emphasis on the minimum fees charged by FCMs, fees that are at least 6 figures per year, fees that have risen since the early days of buy-side clearing, and fees that particularly burden those that transact in small volumes. We are confident that the expenses are in part a function of the leverage ratio, and appreciate that it's economically reasonable for FCMs to be compensated by the buy side for the costs FCMs bear in providing their services. We understand capital and funding requirements, including those that result from the leverage ratio, to be among the most material costs FCMs face. However, we do not believe addressing the leverage ratio, whether through recognition of the risk-reducing nature of initial margin or via mechanisms like direct clearing, to be a silver bullet. Indeed, while direct clearing is in a nascent stage meriting further experience and study, It is our present expectation that direct clearing will not be a game changer for addressing the cost difficulties with clearing for smaller market participants. Of course, we would welcome being proven wrong as the concept and market matures. We believe in FCM's costs to set up and serve clients are high, that a portion of these costs is fixed, and that it is not possible to cover these costs absent sizable minimum fees. Fee difficulties for end users have been further exacerbated as a number of FCMs have determined to leave the business. The leverage ratio no doubt contributed to these market exits. In some cases, these FCMs were among those offering more aggressive fee schedules. As a result of diminished competition from those pricing more aggressively, remaining FCMs have had greater latitude to raise prices, and numerous of our clients are now subject to higher fees than existed at the beginning of their FCM relationships. These difficulties are among the reasons we believe the end user exception from clearing and margin requirement should be expanded. Where certain financial end users do not meaningfully contribute to systemic risk because of the relatively minimal quantity of derivatives activity they undertake, and because they use derivatives to reduce risk, we believe it appropriate and beneficial to scope them out of such requirements. In essence, such an approach would limit the universe of market participants to whom the high cost of clearing, whether resulting from the leverage ratio or from other costs, would directly apply. If appropriately tailored, such an approach could be undertaken without undermining the objectives of Dodd-Frank. While we appreciate the limits of the CFTC's authority to narrow the scope of legislative mandates or to address regulatory burdens imposed by prudential regulators, we believe an open dialogue on whether to revisit the scope of Dodd-Frank mandates is timely and consistent with the CFTC's aim of fostering safe and healthy markets.
Thanks, Lou. Kristen?
So I would just say that, as a risk manager, it certainly makes sense to limit leverage in some way, and certainly leverage was not anyone's friend during the financial crisis. Given that I currently, do risk management at a buy-side firm, I can't speak to this specifically to the impact of leverage on the markets regulated by the CFTC. But what I can say is that there has been structural changes in liquidity risk in both the bond markets and the futures and centrally cleared markets. In the bond markets, you have there's been an ability to adapt and shift. So principally, the bond markets have been OTC in nature for many years. Post financial crisis, they've shifted, in part as a result of regulation and, potentially due to reduced dealer inventory and the impact of regulatory capital on the ability of dealers to kind of intermediate markets. As a result, the markets have shifted more, from purely principal to more of a hybrid principal agent market. And large asset managers like BlackRock have changed the way that they kind of interact and engage in markets. So we don't act as price, we're not acting as principals in markets, but we're certainly acting as price makers on both sides in a way that we never have. And markets, are less liquid in that large blocks now get broken up quite regularly. And so on and so on. The reason for pointing this out is that the bond markets have been able to adapt and change. In addition to the way asset managers now engage directly in markets, there have also been proliferation of more electronic trading trading venues, anonymous, non-anonymous, non-anonymous, partly lit, or dark. And this has changed or shifted liquidity. So we don't, in the bond markets, think that liquidity has been adversely impacted. We just think that the nature of liquidity and its sources has changed. I think my question with regard to markets that are regulated by the CFTC is that the same entities, the same broker-dealers that have changed the nature of how they engage in bond markets are still the clearing members that sit, behind all of the, futures and centrally cleared swap activities that go through your markets. And certainly the number of participants has decreased. We've heard CM clearing members talk about some of the difficulties. And from our perspective, there's been increased interconnectedness risk, more concentration risk, and concerns about, portability in the instance of default. So I don't think I have an answer, but I think clearly the challenge is a little bit greater for the CFTC, given the fact that you just have a small number of market participants that are acting as clearing members. And curious to get others' thoughts on that.
Thank you. Before I come back, I just want to take a couple comments over here.
So this is Bob Wasserman. I just spoke a little bit earlier about some of the concerns I had about our ability to port in the event of a crisis, and I'm not going to come back to that. Rather, I want to talk about two other points. One is, we speak about things like perhaps direct clearing memberships and other solutions. They might work for some of the very large entities, but I think we all know that for the small hedgers, farmers and ranchers who actually this commission was originally formed to help, those solutions are completely irrelevant. And I get very concerned about the impact on those guys of the basically losing available clearing members, increases in prices, and nothing that we're talking about is going to help them. And that, I think, is a very real concern and should be for all of us. The second is that, I hear my learned friends at the prudential regulators, talk about the importance of bank capital. And bank capital is important, and covering risks is important. And having a business that doesn't cover its risk is indeed a bad thing. But the thing to remember is that the leverage ratio is deliberately designed not to be risk sensitive. And so if the biggest part of this battle is over the refusal to recognize the risk-reducing elements of margin. And so if we had a risk-sensitive leverage ratio, then it would cause less market distortion. And so it strikes me that that's a large part of the problem here. And the other thing is that, I'm in talking to my friends and some of the bank regulators, many of them are economists and very concerned around incentives. Well, oddly enough, the leverage ratio creates incentive effects. And it's those incentive effects that I think are causing the problem here. And thus, it seems to me it would be very helpful. At this point, all I have at this point is, I fear, is hope that eventually there is some recognition of the importance of recognizing a more risk-sensitive leverage ratio. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess just responding to that, a leverage ratio that was oriented toward being risk sensitive would no longer be a leverage ratio, because the point of a leverage ratio is precisely that it is a backstop to the risk calculations that are being made by regulators, a backstop that ensures that there is a minimal level of capital and loss absorption in the system. And the leverage ratio, as it applies to derivatives, of course, is not simply the 5% leverage ratio, the 20-to-1 leverage ratio generally, but that 5% is applied to credit exposure metrics that are in turn a very small fraction of the overall notional value of derivatives in the system. I think at commercial banks, when you look at leverage capital as a fraction of notional value, it's something like 3 basis points. And we know that there were very large increases and non-predicted increases in netted credit exposure of derivatives soon before the crisis. And I think what the leverage ratio in the derivatives context is really about is making sure that we have some kind of secure backstop for those unexpected swings that are not predicted by regulators' risk models. And margin, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of the whole margin debate, but margin is money that is owed, if it is money that is owed by people in the system, whether that's banks or clearinghouses, to their members or to their end users, if that is in a completely segregated lockbox somewhere, that's one thing that we can discuss. But this is money that is owed. And I think just to go back on the liquidity discussion that was being discussed before, Anat brought this up, but liquidity is not an unalloyed good. There can be an inverse relationship between liquidity in more ordinary market circumstances and the liquidity that is available in more extreme circumstances. And that is particularly true if the mechanism for supporting liquidity in more normal times is permitting excessive leverage at liquidity providers, because in that circumstance, liquidity providers are going to come under stress in those extreme circumstances, and they are going to pull back. And Anat made reference to changes that could be made in the leverage ratio rules and in how leverage ratios are designed. I mean, I think that that people are open to that, but I think that people have a very great concern about what the total capital is in the system underpinning people's potential exposures in stress periods. And that capital is what is protecting the broader public, people who are not intermediaries in the financial system, from potentially disastrous outcomes in very extreme circumstances. And I do think that if one views this only from the perspective of people who are intermediaries in the financial system, one will get a somewhat skewed perspective, because it is inconvenient for market participants to have to spend additional time finding a buyer when there's unexpected news. That may be a stressful experience for them, but that is part of the natural process of markets. Market volatility is part of the natural process of markets in the face of unexpected news, and some of that additional inconvenience or stress for market participants might be the cost of protecting the broader public.
Thank you. I know we're going slightly over the time that we allotted for this topic, but it's an important topic, I know, for everybody here in the committee. Can I, I've got a couple other people can I go to Sebastian and then Ed?
Thank you. I will definitely agree that I can see that there is a need to look at what the leverage is in the financial system. However, I'm definitely going to agree with the fact that the way the calculations are done right now make not a lot of sense at all. Essentially, there's no calculation method whatsoever to look at any offsets in derivatives that are 99.5%, 99.9% correlated. And it's leading to, first and foremost, also parties like ourselves that are trying to provide liquidity through centrally cleared markets. So the banks that we clear through are held to these leverage ratios. We are going to get excessive fees from them as well, which at the end of the day, the only thing we can do is incorporate them in the prices for the end users. It also, interestingly enough, actually leads to a lot of markets trying to steer clear from having products cleared through financial institutions, which is actually counter to what we're trying to accomplish in the last 5, 6, 7 years. Thirdly, I think this what we've talked about, I think a year and a half ago, this was on the agenda, the fact that there are less and less clearing members out there. Again, this is going to lead to more parties actually pulling out of this business. And I know from an options perspective, obviously, the effect of these 99.5, 99.9 correlations is a lot bigger than some of the other parts of the industry. But we've seen it quite a bit where the actual competitors in this space has dwindled down to pretty much 3 that have a cross-margin possibility between the equities and the future space, which in index options is a very large part of the markets. And then finally, one of our clearing firms actually talked to me about this, and they mentioned exactly what Bob said this morning. The portability of clients, if one of these 3 parties goes down, they will not be able to take any new people on board. So the portability test that we're doing, I would hope that this is part of the test, because quite frankly, I don't see how some of the clearing members will take anyone on. So that doesn't sound like what we try to accomplish.
Thank you. So I heard the phrase capital is a loss absorbing mechanism. That's exactly what initial margin is. clearing members guarantee or willing to guarantee a client's exposure to a clearinghouse because that potential future exposure has been prepaid heavily through initial margin and then supplemented through daily mark-to-market variation margin payments. So the residual risk associated with guaranteeing a client's trades is the conditional probability of a move that's bigger than all that margin collected times the simultaneous insolvency of the client. It's relatively low. And empirically, we know it's relatively low. Then a couple other thoughts. I think three things have changed in the market since the last time we've had to deal with a large-scale porting of risk. We've seen continued consolidation. It's well documented. It's been in flight for years. It's particularly acute in OTC swaps, where I think there's a significant amount of notional. The second thing that's changed is exactly that we're clearing as an industry dozens and dozens of trillions of notional more than we did back when we were dealing with the last porting under, let's say, Lehman or MF Global. And the third thing that's changed is the beginning of the implementation of the Basel III leverage ratio. And so the confluence of fewer participants, a greater concentration of participants, especially within that segment of the market with acute notional sizes, capital rules that are maybe overtaxing or over collateralizing or over capitalizing some of these exposures doesn't feel like a great outcome. And so I do think that it might sound alarmist to talk about porting being a risk, but I think it's untested. I think it's very untested in this current regime where you've got those three sort of confluences of indicators.
So Bob left me speechless, and then Marcus brought speech back to me. So, so thank you, Marcus. I'd like to address some of the things that you raised as comments very directly. I think there is a confusion when it comes to leverage ratio. You have to understand that we are not, when we are talking here, we are not talking about the clearing firm as a principal. We are talking about a clearing firm as an agent. And I think that was clearly articulated by Ed. There is a difference. Nobody here is going to argue against good capital, well-capitalized firms. We all share that goal. That's just not trying to flatter somebody, but it has been a safer market today for us. And as a clearinghouse, for us, the way we look at resources is how Ed pointed out. Our margin and gross margin, client by client gross margin, is the first level of resource. Okay, so a defaulter's margin is the first tier of resource. So you called it an obligation. Actually, it's an asset. It's actually paid in, and it is remote from the agent, and it is sitting at the clearinghouse. Okay, so at the end of the day, the way the problem we have is a flawed understanding of clearing when it comes to thinking about leverage ratio. So we are not talking about or we are not arguing against the concept of leverage being a backstop. It's just that when you compute resources, you have to take into account the fact that resources have been collected. So for an agent, the agent is collecting resources from their clients and actually posting it to a CCP. Now let's talk about the implications. Okay, the implications are here as such. If our goal is a diversified set of clearing members, a diversified set of market participants, and less concentration and less too big to fail or too important to fail, then you should be on the same page as us in terms of recognizing the fact that, we need as many participants as possible to have access to markets. Now, as Bob pointed out very, very clearly, futures markets or derivative markets are used as hedging tools. You have a lot of end users here around the table who are they need access to these markets, and they do not want to face the clearinghouse directly because they cannot. There are clearing firms that perform an important role from a risk perspective in monitoring the risk and making sure that on top of our margin, they collect more margin. And that margin is credit sensitive margin, and all that asset, according to CFTC rules, is segregated, is completely segregated from the proprietary funds. So at the end of the day, when you look at the concept of leverage, it has no bearing. There is no relationship between that and a cleared market. So there is a complete misunderstanding of client clearing when designing supplemental leverage ratio as it applies to bank affiliated clearing members. So thanks for bringing my speech back, but
All right, we're going to move on to the repo topic. I know the leverage ratio is near and dear to everybody's heart, and we can perhaps circle back back here at the end if we have time. But the repo markets are obviously a critical source of short-term liquidity that fuels the derivatives markets, and the CFTC has asked what is the state of the repo market, both from a liquidity and a functioning perspective. I'd like to get some of the views from the MRAC members about the repo market. And if I could, I might start off with Susan.
I promise not to mention leverage ratio in this particular topic, but I think it's part of, I think it's influencing some of the changes we've seen in the repo markets. I think with regards to the functioning of the markets today, I think interdealer things continue to function well. I think collateral has responded well since money market reform. We continue to see collateral being well bid, and obviously a richening of collateral driven by the move of money market investors to govie funds, as well as broader market requirements for collateral itself. If you think about institutionally, banks' requirements for margin, both subject from a UMR and clearing perspective. What I'd like to focus on is the client impact. And I think, to quote Dickens, it's a tale of two clients. We have those who want leverage and we have those who are liquidity providers. There's three core issues that continue, to me, to be the core ones. And, it's very simple. It's capacity, access, and pricing. How have these changed? And if we just look at capacity first, and let's look at our leverage takers. The leverage ratio has either seen dealers cut balance sheets entirely or reduce balance sheets for smaller market participants. Or you have seen kind of a intra-month provision of balance sheet, which effectively disappears at month and quarter ends. So I think, it's either gone for good or it is available. It is not available probably at times when it's most important. When I think about the capacity for liquidity providers, there's increased liquidity in the system, but less places to deploy that liquidity, because it comes back to the dealer capacity to be able to provide that short-term treasury repo because of the ratio that we've just continually debated about. So what has the market done, and what is the response? Well, we see the evolution of peer-to-peer platforms, and they continue to grow, and it's where effectively liquidity providers will face leverage takers directly. Now, I think they're still somewhat in establishment versus growth phase, but I don't think they will solve the mismatch in maturity issue between those two types of market participants, but it definitely solves potentially a capacity issue. It also potentially creates some type of pricing, access to potentially better pricing. Then the other option is obviously clearing, and that's very topical here, given the number of clearing houses here, because obviously everyone's working on a solution to try and bring those clients into clearing. Now, we've been very supportive of, expansion of memberships for clients in repo for probably now, I'd say 3-4 years. And, from a kind of sequencing perspective, I think we've always felt that liquidity providers should come into the clearinghouse first to be able to get the liquidity in there so it can be deployed to the institutions who seek liquidity. Now, obviously, not to call out anyone, but obviously FICC have filed with the SEC a membership solution for Treasury tri-party repo called CCIT. This will allow non-RIC institutions to be able to trade reverse repo on treasuries with dealers, which effectively will give a new new trading environment where they can deploy this liquidity and be able to capture some of the pricing benefits that you see trading on GCF repo versus where the funds are actually paying it on a return basis. Now, with regards to so that's kind of solving the capacity issue. Now, I think there are other clearinghouses working on similar type solutions, but it's just it is a kind of, I'd say, the next step to be able to addressing those issues. Now, it also obviously will feed into the broader discussions that we've been talking about around CCP default management, but I'm not going to focus on those there. Now, if you think about the other side of the coin, the leverage takers, how do you establish a clearing membership for institutions who seek leverage? Does the traditional FCM model work in repo? It actually doesn't. So a number of clearinghouses have been working to establish an FCM light model to be able to facilitate access of these institutions who are seeking liquidity into these clearinghouses. Now, many of those esteemed clearinghouses are sitting around this table, and I think we should see a solution, I would say, in the next 12 to 18 months, subject to regulatory approval. However, there are, I would say, differing regulatory impacts for US banks versus European institutions as to what the potential regulatory capital costs of actually offering that service to institutions who are seeking leverage and financing on assets such as treasuries or bunds or gilts. So I think that is one asymmetric regulatory impact we've observed, and I think the clearinghouses are trying to solve to that issue. Now, where does this get us all? I think with regards to, if we think about the three core issues, capacity, access, and pricing, we've seen access disappear for clients because of dealers being constrained from a resource perspective, and therefore, capacity, has also been constrained. If we think about clearing being the solution, it definitely solves a capacity issue for our clients, because we do believe, and dealers do believe, that they can provide that intermediation capacity in clearing in a way that is more resource efficient and to be able to redeploy that capacity to clients. Access will be solved by clearinghouses establishing appropriate memberships for both types of clients, which we all look forward to seeing. And then pricing. So we have observed the basis in pricing between cleared versus uncleared in many markets. I think that will probably emerge in repo too, because ultimately it will come back to dealers pricing in their resources and clients being able to benefit from potentially those resource savings, be it SLR or RWA capital, by looking to execute those transactions in a cleared environment. So it almost solves all three. There will be increased capacity in a clearinghouse that you don't see today in the uncleared markets. And also, in theory, the pricing may be more attractive. So I think it creates a lot of, it solves a lot of the current issues that clients are facing in the markets today. I'll stop there.
Sunil, do you want to?
That was a very nice setup by Susan. Thank you for that. I think I'd add two other things that clearing achieves. The Fed, when the Federal Reserve, and thinking about reforms for the repo market, was concerned about two risks. One was run risk, and the other is fire sale risk. And I think clearing is meant to solve those two as well. So any clearing solution that is out there will have to address those two. And we know from clearing and the way it manages defaults is to actually solve for the run risk, and the fire sale risks is to actually provision for liquidity during the period where the asset is being liquidated in the open market. So I think in addition to what Susan pointed out, those are two additional benefits that clearing would bring to the repo market.
Tom?
Well, I represent the grain handlers, processors, feed mills, so my comments are really more granular. I'm going to make a comment about repos and actually an interest rate environment, all right? A little bit of, Susan's comment about the fact that there's a lot of liquidity and trying to find a place to go. I would say that as it comes to a grain handler, our use of capital is either from futures, derivatives, hedging, margin calls, or inventories. In this country, we've got growing inventories of all commodities, corn, beans, wheat, that requires more capital. Answering to the question, the interest rate environment, interest rates are creeping higher, doesn't really have an impact on our industry right now because prices are so low. Also get to the repo, where unlike derivatives and repos, really we use repos to fund inventories. And with such large inventories in this country, it ends up being quite a big deal. At this point, I would say that there's ample capacity. It seems like we get a call a day from someone that wants to fund inventories and not using as much capital as they would normally use. Changes when we get prices a lot higher. So it's just kind of a heads up. At some point, it changes. The other thing we've noticed in the industry, with prices lower, we're starting to see, I would say, an interest rate issue maybe on the farm community, where you actually have farmers that are struggling because prices are lower, and therefore, they have a harder time getting a return. The result of that is that margins in the grain industry have actually declined over the last couple of years. I would say after 10 years of quite attractive margins and a lot of liquidity, what we're seeing right now in the environment is that margins are shrinking. That does have an impact. Doesn't have an impact to today, but go through a period of time where you have lower margins and get a spike in prices, all of a sudden the liquidity changes quite a bit. So again, it's maybe even off topic because everything we're talking about here are futures and derivatives and hedging and what is regulated by the commission. But there is another side of funding and liquidity that it relates to the grain handlers.
Any more comments that I could have on the Marcus?
I just wanted to respond to Sunil before. So this is not about repo, but
it's not about leverage ratio either, is it?
It is about the leverage ratio. Just a quick response to Sunil. I think that the question. The question that continually comes up with this is that if the margin is truly simply an asset that is held by the clearinghouse, then why does it appear on the bank's balance sheet? And why do we have prudential regulators consistently saying to us that in many cases the banks do have control over investment of that margin and do receive revenue from the investment of that margin? And that's number one. And number two, I think all this sort of indirectly relates to these debates over clearinghouse resolution, because when you look at the clearinghouse default fund, it becomes very clear that the level of capital and the financial stability of the clearing members is something that very much could come into play in terms of, where are the other sources of private sector loss absorbency once you get past margin if they are not going to be in the solvency of the clearing members. Now, I realize that clearing is a different risk management method, then it relies on the exchange of margin based on market prices. Its capital only comes into play when clearing has failed, in some sense, or when that risk management mechanism has failed. But I think it just continues to be a really important question: how much private sector backstop do we have, including through the clearing members? So.
Okay, I know you want to answer that, but we're going to go on to the last topic that the CFTC asked that you guys we talked about, and that was uncleared margin. They're asking, why was there a surge in clearing of NDFs and inflation swaps after the margin rules were implemented? And what was the impact on liquidity, if any? Have the margin rules caused market participants to shift to other lower cost products to do their hedging? Luke, do you want to start?
So Chatham serves a broad range of end users, including non-financial end users such as multinational corporations and even professional football teams, financial end users such as regional and community banks. And we also serve those that uncomfortably straddle the line, including real estate funds, which fundamentally invest in non-financial assets through entities that are themselves non-financial. but do so with an ownership structure that includes collective investment vehicles that are deemed financial as a matter of U.S. law. The margin rules implemented for these entities on March 1 have been among the most consequential of the Dodd-Frank reforms for the markets broadly and for many of our clients, especially those with financial affiliates. Of course, margin rules are the most germane to the issues that arose with AIG's derivatives positions, which, because of their illiquid nature, are not of a type that would have been appropriate for clearinghouses. It's worth noting that margin and clearing rules represent a public policy wager. They were purposed to attack credit risk in the system, but they did so at the expense of increased liquidity risk. By liquidity risk, I mean that sharp market movements give rise to margin calls, which in turn necessitate that a firm have access to liquid resources to meet those calls. In the event of insufficient liquid resources, a firm will fail. And while the consequences of that failure may not be felt within the derivatives market ecosystem because the firm's positions are collateralized, the derivatives market ecosystem will be complicit in the pain the firm's failure causes in the economy. This is not to say that I think the wager was wrong. Time will tell. But I do believe we should not look at margin requirements as an unmitigated good. For example, and as previously stated, I believe margin requirements for financial end users whose positions are not systemically significant and that use derivatives for risk management purposes were established without sufficient evidence as to the potential for harm to the financial system. The imposition of costly requirements on those undertaking societally valuable business practices, that is, risk reduction activity, which bring no harm to others, has created adverse consequences. In particular, it has increased incentives for market participants to use products or strategies that imperfectly address their risk management objectives or that address their objectives at significant costs. In some cases, these costs can be prohibitive. For example, market participants may undertake a series of kind of responses to these high costs associated with these requirements. They may substitute fixed rate loans for swapped floating rate loans, even though the pricing and prepayment characteristics of the floating rate loan are superior. They may substitute options for swaps or swaps for options due to the economic or administrative impacts of each of the products. They may use standardized exchange-traded futures instead of customized OTC derivatives to satisfy their risk management needs, generally taking on some basis risk in the process. Or they may use exempt FX forwards as a substitute hedge for FX options or collars. Or at worst, they may choose not to hedge. While each of these distortions in market activity suggests that market participants are, in most cases, finding ways to hedge their risks, the manner in which they hedge them has in some cases changed. These kinds of changes afford little or no benefit to society, even while they cause harm to the risk management disciplines of individual companies.
Do we have any other members who would like to comment on the uncleared margin situation? Susan?
So I'm just going to comment predominantly on the clearing of NDF. So it's a product that Morgan Stanley started clearing in 2015. So I think we were one of the first three. And I think, we've seen a migration of dealers to clear NDFs, not more kind of, I think, I think some institutions probably wanted to do it beforehand, but I think it's a general sense of, let's understand what, the pricing of, resources is around both options. I think, from our perspective, I think the centralization of liquidity in a clearinghouse in a short-dated product like this is an appropriate venue for this, but also as well, it then establishes, effectively a sense as to trading the product cleared, under a clearinghouse rules and margin versus under UMR from a resource perspective. Now, I don't think, and I think that ultimately gets us back to the original, aim here was to centrally clear as many products as possible, which are appropriate from a liquidity and risk management perspective. I think, it just, it accelerated what a lot of institutions were planning to do. But then when you think about the broader kind of currency portfolio, if we look forward, you will see that, cross-currency swaps and, FX forwards are all in many clearinghouses kind of, plans for this year to establish a central clearing venue and environment for those types of products. I do think, it's probably actually more expensive to clear NDFs at the moment than it is to trade under SIM because of, a lot of dealers are executing their hedging activity there. So when you're direction in the clearinghouse, it tends to be more expensive. So I don't think it's necessarily a cheaper option for dealers yet. We see and expect clients to actually start clearing NDFs, towards the end of this year. So I think that will balance the members within that particular clearinghouse and also potentially make those margin costs, more balanced. But I don't think it was a cheaper option for many dealers, despite when you actually run the numbers on a comparable basis, because it's something that we obviously look and monitor as part of our broader kind of resource management view. But I think it was a collective. I think UMR was a influence, but I don't necessarily think it resulted in cheaper margins for dealers because of who's actually clearing at the clearinghouse and also the risk that those dealers are bringing into the clearinghouse.
We have 1 more minute. Jerry, you have to comment? We've just got 1 more minute before we close
As
up.
it relates to the commodities market, Luke mentioned the March 1 requirement for margin, which actually the Commission provided relief out to September. It has created some strife in connection with those that are end users that do transact in swaps, that transact with a bank. ISDA put out a protocol yet again that's essentially forced folks to either opt out, characterizing themselves as a non-financial entity, which on its face one would think is a rather easy analysis to make. But when you actually look at the definition of what a financial entity is under CFTC regs and other prudential regulators dictate a litany of various types of entities that fall under a financial entity. So I would suggest that definition be readdressed because it's certainly not fit for purpose for many, and has caused those that are offering swaps as dealers that are non-margined, non-cleared, to make that determination between themselves. So in other words, the relationship has been stressed. And it's something that, although it's kind of been mitigated by the relief, it's going to come about again in September.
Thank you. I think we've come pretty much to the end of this session, so let me just make 1 or 2 very quick closing remarks before handing the microphone over to Petal and then to Acting Chairman and Commissioner Bowen. First of all, I want to thank all of the MRAC members for coming here today. It's been an insightful discussion, I am sure, for the CFTC. All of you have taken the time to leave your day jobs and come here and participate, and I'm sure that they appreciate it. One thing that I find absolutely refreshing is the fact that all of you come here with your views, and not all of them are the same. And people bring different perspectives to the marketplace, and a marketplace is about different perspectives, and it's great to have all of you come here and share those with the CFTC. So before I hand that over, though, I just wanted to let you guys know one thing that just happened to come across I happened to find out just recently, and he's going to get very embarrassed, but our acting chairman here happens to be a very, very accomplished musician. And he is a very good guitarist who plays in a band, and he is, I'm pretty sure that at the FIA in Boca next year, when he does the chairman's remarks, he is going to show up there with the guitar, and he's going to be singing to all of you a very famous song by the Rolling Stones called "You Can't Always Get What You Want." On that note, can I hand it back over to Petal?
Thank you, John. It is now time for closing remarks.
I don't know how to respond to "you can't always get what you want," but we certainly heard a lot of both short-term concerns that the commission has been asked to take into account as we look at some things that are coming up in the next few months, but also some longer-term concerns about the health and the stability and the durability of the markets that we oversee, and the perspective that as I listened to the remarks, all of which I found very helpful across the board, all well-based, well-argued. At the end of the day, the concern that I have is that our markets continue to serve healthy risk transfer, which is essential to economic growth, which has been something that I've been talking about since I came to this commission. Will continue to talk about for so long as I serve on this commission. And so, when I view the issues, I think about them in terms of are they supportive of the strength, vitality, and durability of the markets that are necessary for risk transfer? Because without risk transfer, you can't have healthy investment, and healthy investment is necessary for economic growth, which is certainly something that we've had a public discussion on in the past few months here in this country. And I think that the emphasis certainly of the new administration is toward generating healthy, strong, sustainable, and broad-based economic growth. So those are the things I'll bear in mind as I reflect on some of the things we heard today. So over to our sponsor.
Great, thank you so much. I really want to thank our facilitators today who did a fantastic job. Susan O'Flynn, Dennis McLaughlin, and John Nixon. Really tough questions. All three panels were extremely substantive. I think I said at the beginning that I thought that this would be one of the most interesting and informative discussions we've had, which was a pretty high bar. Well, you guys actually met that today. So I have no idea what we're going to do in our June meeting, but it's a pretty high bar. I also want to thank our key speakers who provided important insight for our commission to consider. And finally, I want to thank our logistical staff, my staff, Acting Chairman Giancarlo and his staff for participating today. Thanks so much, everyone.
The meeting is adjourned. For those AMRAC members who are joining us for lunch, we're going to meet at the door and I'll try to leave at 1:25. Thank you.